Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, a quiet corner where ancient worlds drift into the present and old stories find room to breathe again. Tonight, we unfold a tale that has lingered in clay, echoed through temples, and travelled through the long corridors of human memory. It is the story of a name that once thundered across the heavens, a name that reshaped myth, power, and the understanding of what it meant to rule. The name is Marduk, the figure many ancient scribes described as the mightiest of the Anunnaki, the one who rose higher than his peers and carved his place not only in myth, but in the imagination of civilizations that would follow long after Babylon's glow sank into the dust. Before we begin, I wonder where you're listening from tonight and what the hour is in your part of the world, whether the evening is settling softly around you or the early morning feels still and waiting. If this journey brings you comfort or curiosity, if it lets you drift a little more easily into the quiet of your own thoughts, I'd be grateful if you liked the video or subscribed so this calm space can reach more wandering listeners. Now, settle in as the story opens, because the tale of Marduk does not begin with thunder or conquest. It begins with something far more familiar: the slow rise of importance, the steady gathering of influence, and the way a single name can travel through time. Marduk's story is layered, shaped by countless hands and retold by generations who each left their own fingerprints on his memory. When we speak his name now, we're touching a figure who once stood at the top of a divine hierarchy. Yet he didn't start as the ruler of anything. He existed first as a local god, quietly kept, quietly honoured, with no hint that his path would lead to cosmic authority. The people who first carved his name into clay tablets likely imagined him as a guardian of a single place, watching over their homes and their daily concerns. But the world he would grow into, and the story he would assume, stretched far beyond these modest beginnings. Babylon, the city that would become inseparable from him, was once just another settlement among many. Its influence didn't yet radiate outward. Its walls were not yet the symbol of a kingdom or an empire. And yet, from those early foundations, the seeds of a transformation were already present. What started as modest homage would rise into the epic memory of a people who believed their god had stepped beyond the boundaries of the earth itself. As the city of Babylon slowly gathered strength, its identity began to entwine with Marduk's. A god is shaped by the aspirations of those who follow him, and as Babylon grew, its people looked toward Marduk as the one who could embody their ascent. This wasn't a sudden shift, nor a dramatic turning point. It was a gradual evolution that mirrored the way real stories change over long stretches of time. Step by step, Marduk's prominence grew. Scribes placed him in hymns where once his name would not have appeared. Priests elevated his rituals. Artists carved scenes of his power. The earliest whispers of a rising deity took hold. And soon, Marduk was no longer merely one among many, but someone whose presence demanded larger stories, grander origins, and firmer placement within the divine hierarchy. This transformation wasn't unique in the ancient world, but the scale of Marduk's change was extraordinary. Many gods held local roles that expanded as cities grew, yet few ever reached the heights that Marduk would one day inhabit. What made his rise so compelling is how seamlessly it wove into the political, cultural, and spiritual movements of the time. Babylon didn't declare its god the greatest overnight. Instead, the belief slowly became a cultural certainty. When empires grew, they needed symbols that could unify diverse peoples and bring coherence to expanding territories. Marduk became that symbol. His attributes began to absorb those of other gods. Stories that once belonged to different deities migrated into his orbit. His mythology stretched to contain battles and victories that earlier traditions had given to other celestial figures. It's a process scholars sometimes describe as theological consolidation, but for the people living through it, it likely felt perfectly natural. Their city was rising, their god was rising, their identity was taking a clearer shape, and Marduk became the vessel through which that identity expressed itself. One of the most striking elements of his ascent was the way earlier cosmic narratives began to shift. The old stories of creation and cosmic struggle existed long before Marduk's prominence. These tales belong to older gods like Enlil and Enki, whose roles as creator, organizer, or ruler were deeply rooted in earlier Sumerian traditions. But as Babylon's influence spread, the great stories changed hands. Marduk inherited roles that once belonged to others. He stepped into cosmic battles that earlier myths had placed elsewhere. The heavens themselves seemed to rearrange to accommodate him. This shift wasn't simply theological, it was cultural, political, and symbolic. The rise of a new power required a story worthy of that power, and so the myths evolved to meet the moment. Yet beneath these grand narratives lies a quieter truth. Marduk's rise tells us something about how humans shape their gods, and how gods in turn shape the worldviews of their followers. The ancient scribes who wrote the tablets weren't just copying stories, they were constructing meaning. They were placing events into a framework that explained why their city mattered, why their rituals held importance, and why their god deserved reverence above all others. Through these stories, Marduk became more than a deity. He became the axis around which power and purpose could revolve, and the people who honoured him found in him a reflection of their own aspirations, fears, triumphs, and uncertainties. To understand Marduk is to recognise how myth and history intertwine. The past didn't exist as a clean chronology for the Babylonians. It existed as something fluid, shaped by interpretation and rewritten through ritual. Each new retelling of Marduk's deeds reinforced his stature. Each festival, each recited hymn, each inscription carved into a temple wall solidified the belief that this god wasn't simply powerful. He was essential, necessary, central. And with every retelling, his story gained clarity. Not because new information was discovered, but because memory deepened, and the image of the god sharpened as the culture around him evolved. This kind of transformation is familiar in the history of religions. We see it with other deities whose influence expanded alongside the rise of their associated cities or empires. But Marduk's ascent stands out because of the sheer scale of the change, and the way his story ultimately swallowed whole traditions, reshaping them into something broader and more encompassing. The Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian epic that celebrates his victory over chaos, is perhaps the clearest reflection of this shift. Though that tale belongs later in the narrative, the groundwork for its creation begins here, in these early phases where Babylon's identity and Marduk's role became inseparable. The city needed a divine champion, a protector, a ruler of unimaginable authority, and so the stories rose to meet that need. Understanding the opening of Marduk's tale also means seeing how these early developments fit into the broader fabric of Mesopotamian belief. The region was a constellation of cities, each with its own patron gods, each with its own traditions and mythic histories. Rivalries existed between cities just as they did between dynasties and political factions. When one city gained prominence, the authority of its god often expanded as well. It's not difficult to imagine how this interwoven relationship between politics and religion gradually elevated Marduk to a place no one could have predicted when his name first appeared in modest offerings. The story becomes not only one of myth, but one of human ambition, human creativity, and human need for order. As the centuries passed and the foundations of Babylon strengthened, the scribes who maintained the sacred texts refined Marduk's identity even further. They emphasized qualities that set him apart: wisdom, strength, justice, a kind of celestial steadiness that made him a reliable centerpiece in a world often shaped by uncertainty. The gods of Mesopotamia were not distant or abstract. They interacted constantly with the world, influencing everything from the weather to the fortunes of kings. For the Babylonians, elevating Marduk meant elevating their confidence in their city's destiny. It established a shared belief that their protector had both the authority and the capability to guide them, defend them, and bring meaning to their daily lives. As Marduk rose to cosmic significance, his story became not merely one of divine ascent, but a reflection of the anxieties and hopes of the people who carried his name through time. The more he grew, the more essential he became to their understanding of what it meant to live under his protection. And as his influence expanded beyond Babylon to neighbouring regions and later empires, the echoes of his story travelled farther than anyone could have expected. His name would eventually weave its way into discussions of creation, kingship, order, and cosmic struggle. And from those discussions, a fuller picture of the Anunnaki pantheon would emerge, placing Marduk at the centre of a celestial drama that shaped their worldview. With this foundation laid, the story continues into the period before his power took its greatest form, a time when he still walked among greater figures and when the hierarchy of gods had not yet been rewritten. The rise from quiet beginnings to a position of unmatched authority did not happen all at once. Each step carried consequences for how the ancient world interpreted the divine. Each shift brought new layers to an already complex landscape of beliefs. And from these early developments, the path toward his eventual dominance begins to take shape in clearer terms, guiding the narrative toward the moments that would define him forever. Long before Marduk stood at the centre of creation stories, long before the ceremonies of Babylon lifted his name toward the sky, he existed in a quieter state, woven into a world where the hierarchy of gods had already been shaped by much older traditions. In that early landscape, he did not hold dominion over storms or creation or kingship. He was one presence among many, surrounded by deities whose influence stretched across cities, fields, rivers, and seasons. Understanding this period allows us to see how his rise began, not through sudden force or dramatic change, but through the patient shaping of identity, memory, and circumstance. When we picture the ancient pantheon of Mesopotamia, it's easy to imagine a rigid structure where each god occupied a fixed role. But in truth, these roles shifted constantly as stories evolved, as cities grew or declined, and as scribes adapted older traditions into newer frameworks. In this shifting environment, Marduk's early nature was not yet fused with the sweeping authority he would one day claim. Instead, he belonged to a younger generation of gods whose attributes remained flexible, undefined, and open to interpretation. This flexibility gave later storytellers room to expand his identity in ways that earlier gods, already bound to long-established roles, could not easily accommodate. In these early traditions, Marduk appeared sometimes as a figure associated with water through his father, Enki, one of the most ancient and widely respected deities in Mesopotamian belief. Enki, known for his wisdom and creative power, shaped the world with thought and intention. His influence reached into the minds of kings and the flow of rivers, aligning the elements of life with the needs of the people. To be linked to such a god gave Marduk a place in the lineage of order and craft, but lineage alone did not guarantee prominence. Myths do not automatically elevate the children of powerful gods. In fact, many divine offspring remained minor figures for thousands of years, overshadowed by their parents' established reputations. Marduk's youth was defined not by dramatic feats, but by an environment where divine attributes were constantly shifting. Many gods in Mesopotamian traditions began with modest roles, often tied to local cults or specific natural features. A god might watch over a region or a profession, serve as a protector for a city, or embody a certain natural force. From these origins, stories grew and stretched as communities shaped their beliefs around their lived experiences. Marduk's early position as a local deity of Babylon placed him within this pattern. Yet there were subtle elements in his background that distinguished him even before his rise began. One of those elements came from the way Babylon itself began to slowly emerge as a cultural and political centre. Though far from the dominant city it would become, Babylon possessed a quiet stability during certain periods, when other cities faced conflict or natural challenges. This stability allowed religious traditions to settle and grow, laying groundwork for a more centralized identity. Marduk, as the local god, naturally became part of this foundation. The people living within the city walls turned to him not because he was the greatest among the divine, but because he was theirs. That sense of connection, born from daily rituals and simple offerings, formed the earliest roots of loyalty that would later expand into something far larger. This period of Marduk's early identity is also important because it reveals how myth can grow from everyday life, rather than from dramatic events. Many ancient gods gained prominence through the consolidation of stories that originally had little to do with them. A city would adopt a ritual, borrow a hymn from a neighbouring region, or merge traditions because of shared cultural needs. Over time, these small adjustments accumulated until they reshaped the pantheon itself. Marduk's youth belonged to this slow-moving current, a gradual process that reflected the shifting needs of a community that began to see itself differently. The religious world he grew up in, so to speak, was already crowded with powerful figures. Anu, king of the sky; Enlil, the wind lord whose decisions shaped the fates of gods and men; Enki, the wise craftsman of creation; Ninhursag, mother of mountains and life itself; Inanna, fierce goddess of power and desire; and countless others who governed every aspect of existence. Each of these beings had thousands of years of stories behind them, festivals dedicated in their honour, and temples that stood long before Babylon's name carried any significance. Marduk, by comparison, entered this world with little more than a place of worship and the respect of a modest community. This imbalance might suggest that his youth was overshadowed by the presence of older gods, yet in Mesopotamian belief systems, being new or less established did not necessarily mean being less important. In fact, it opened possibilities. Without ancient stories binding him to fixed roles, Marduk could absorb traits, responsibilities, and myths that might otherwise belong to different deities. His early lack of defined attributes made him adaptable. This adaptability, combined with Babylon's gradual rise, created the conditions necessary for a transformation that would eventually reshape the entire pantheon. During this phase, Marduk's developing identity reflected something unique about Mesopotamian culture: the belief that the divine world could evolve in response to human experience. People did not simply inherit myths, they reinterpreted them, added to them, and sometimes replaced earlier ideas with new ones that felt more relevant to their lives. When Babylon needed a protector, Marduk became one. When it needed a symbol of its growing strength, he absorbed roles associated with kingship and authority. When it later needed a figure powerful enough to embody cosmic order, he inherited stories far older than his earliest worshippers might have imagined. To imagine Marduk in his youth is to imagine him surrounded by figures whose reputations towered over his. Many of the older deities had direct connections to natural forces or fundamental cosmic principles. Enlil could command storms and shape destinies. Enki could fashion life, devise solutions to divine conflicts and regulate the world's waters. In contrast, Marduk's early traits were still forming, still negotiable, still waiting for definition. He was not yet the slayer of chaos, not yet the king of gods, not yet the holder of the tablets of destiny. He was present, acknowledged, and respected, but not fully realized. Yet even in this early stage, there were hints that he would one day stand apart. Some of the qualities associated with him, wisdom inherited from his lineage, a growing association with storms, and a protective instinct toward the city that worshipped him, suggested potential for a more significant role. Myths often grow around these kinds of quiet beginnings. A detail mentioned in one hymn becomes expanded in another. A ritual originally performed for Enki might, over generations, become associated with Marduk due to lineage and cultural shift. A festival celebrated in one century might grow in importance in the next, eventually becoming a defining ceremony. Nothing in Marduk's youth locked him into a fixed identity. Instead, The early strands of his story provided space for growth. This period is especially interesting because it highlights the human process behind divine evolution. When people worshipped Marduk, they did so out of a relationship that felt direct and intimate. A local god was part of their daily rhythms, farmers seeking protection for their fields, merchants hoping for safe travel, families offering thanks for the birth of a child. These small acts of devotion shaped the emotional landscape from which larger myths would one day emerge. This connection between everyday life and evolving divine identity is what allowed Marduk's story to gradually extend beyond Babylon's walls. From the perspective of myth-making, Marduk's youth represents a kind of blank canvas, though not in a poetic or simplistic sense. It simply means that the stories that later defined him were not yet attached to his name. He existed in a state of potential, gathering associations as the cultural world shifted around him. His early worshippers likely imagined him as a guardian, a provider, a presence looking after the needs of their emerging city. That basic sense of protection would become a lasting part of his identity, even as his mythology expanded into cosmic territory. Understanding his beginnings also means acknowledging how slowly these changes unfolded. There was no single event that suddenly elevated him, no decisive moment when scribes announced a new hierarchy. Instead, there were centuries of incremental adjustments as Babylon's people redefined themselves through rituals, festivals, and political alliances. Marduk's story grew with them, shaped by the rhythm of their lives. Over time, he became intertwined with their ambitions. His role widened, his symbolic weight increased, and the gods around him, once dominant, began to share or relinquish aspects of their authority as cultural memory shifted. This transitional phase between being a relatively minor local deity and becoming a central figure in the pantheon shows us how myth can evolve, not through grand creation, but through the steady accumulation of influence. As Babylon expanded its reach, absorbed neighbouring regions, and developed its own administrative and cultural systems, the need for a unifying divine figure increased. Marduk, tied to the city's destiny from its earliest days, naturally stepped into this role. The god who once watched over a modest settlement was now being imagined as someone capable of guiding a growing civilization. Even in this youth, before battles against cosmic beings or the claiming of powerful relics, Marduk's identity held a promise that later generations would fulfill on his behalf. The foundations for his rise were laid not by dramatic action, but by the slow yet powerful combination of devotion, cultural necessity, and the evolving structure of belief. When we examine this early stage closely, we can see how the threads of his story were being woven long before the epic myths took shape. Each detail, each hymn, each ritual laid down another layer, and the quiet presence of a young god among older established deities became the starting point for one of the most transformative developments in ancient mythology. Through these steady changes, Marduk's role began to widen in ways that reflected the growing identity of Babylon itself. The city was no longer just another settlement in the landscape of Mesopotamia. It was becoming a hub of trade, culture, and influence. Its inhabitants saw themselves differently, and this change required a divine identity that matched their expanding worldview. These early shifts in Marduk's story set the stage for what would come, guiding the narrative toward the moment when his ascent would collide with the greatest cosmic struggle preserved in Mesopotamian literature. From the modest beginnings of a local guardian, the path ahead leads directly toward the emergence of a Stormbearer, a warrior, and a deity whose influence would reshape the heavens. And as these early elements gathered force, the story of Marduk continued to grow, carrying us steadily into the next stage of his journey. In the quiet stretch between Marduk's earliest presence and the moment his name rose across the ancient world, something fundamental began to shift in the way he was imagined. The local guardian of Babylon slowly gathered attributes that carried him far beyond the city's walls. These changes did not happen through sudden leaps or dramatic rewriting. but through an accumulation of stories, rituals, and beliefs that gradually redefined him. Among the traits that took shape during this period, one became particularly significant, not only for his later myths, but for how people understood his power. Marduk began to be associated with storms, winds, and the controlled force of natural upheaval. The emergence of this identity marked the beginning of his transformation into a god whose strength could shape both the heavens and the earth. Storms held a particular importance in the ancient world. They were unpredictable, often destructive, yet essential for the fertility of the land. A storm could nourish the fields one season and devastate them the next. This dual nature gave storm-bearing deities a special kind of authority. They represented power that could not be ignored or diminished. The cultures of Mesopotamia deeply respected the forces of weather because their lives depended on understanding and adapting to them. To connect a god with storms was to place that god within a realm of influence that shaped daily existence. As stories and rituals began to link Marduk with these natural forces, his identity grew more formidable, more present, and more capable of carrying the weight of a city's aspirations. The world in which this transformation took place was not empty of rival gods. Many deities already held positions tied to storms and winds. Enlil, the powerful ruler of the air, controlled weather, fate, and the balance of creation. To attribute Stormbearer characteristics to Marduk was not a replacement of these older roles, but a gradual merging of traits. Myth was flexible enough to adapt new figures into existing frameworks, without immediately displacing the old. Instead of challenging the ancient order directly, Marduk began to inherit, echo, and extend the storm-bearing power associated with gods who had dominated the skies for millennia. This slow expansion allowed his authority to reach upward, setting the stage for conflicts that would place him at the centre of cosmic struggles. The idea of Marduk as a figure who could command storms emerged from a combination of literary tradition and cultural necessity. Babylon's rise required a deity whose attributes matched the scale of its ambitions. A god limited to modest domains could not adequately reflect the identity of a city expanding in influence. As Babylon matured, its people increasingly imagined their guardian as someone capable of shaping larger forces. Marduk's connection with storms symbolized this broader scope. It suggested that he was no longer tied solely to a specific location, but was becoming a being whose presence extended across the sky itself. The more Babylon grew, the stronger this connection became. This period of Marduk's development is also marked by the gradual blending of older stories into his emerging identity. Ancient myths from various cities across Mesopotamia already contained narratives of divine conflict, battles between cosmic beings, and dramatic encounters that shaped the structure of the universe. When Babylon's teachers and scribes began to reinterpret these tales, they drew on this abundant tradition to give Marduk a role within stories that once featured other gods. This process was not viewed as rewriting history, but as harmonizing belief with the political and cultural reality of the time. For the people of Babylon, their city's rise meant their god deserved a central place in the stories that explained the workings of the cosmos. Through this process, Marduk slowly moved from being a figure of local devotion to one who could shape celestial events. This was not yet the full extent of his rise, but it established the premise that he was a god capable of meeting challenges that demanded strength and mastery of natural forces. The storms he came to embody were more than simple weather patterns. They represented the ability to bring order to chaos, to stand against forces that threatened stability, and to act with precision even in the face of overwhelming conflict. This growing connection between Marduk and storm-bearing power reflected both the needs of his followers and the traditions of myth that surrounded him. The early depiction of Marduk as a storm-bearer also carried political meaning. Other powerful gods across the ancient world were often associated with storms. In neighbouring cultures, deities like Adad and Hadad wielded lightning and thunder. Further west, storm gods shaped the identities of entire civilizations. The ability to command storms was not only a sign of divine strength but a mark of supreme authority. To assign these traits to Marduk suggested that Babylon was ready to compete with the great cultural centres surrounding it. The people were not challenging older traditions outright, but signalling that their god, like their city, had grown strong enough to participate in the broader tapestry of divine authority. When ancient people imagined their gods, they were not thinking of distant beings drifting silently above the world. They saw them as active participants in the events that shaped their lives. Storms arrived with a kind of intention, a force that could be read, feared, or respected. Marduk's emerging connection with these forces meant he was becoming a figure who acted with influence, rather than simply being honoured in ritual. His power became something visible, something experienced, something that could be imagined as sweeping across the plains during the turbulent seasons. The sounds of thunder, the sting of wind, the arrival of rain, these were not merely weather events. For many, they became signs of a god whose strength was rising. This shift in perception laid the groundwork for a narrative transformation that would eventually crystallize into one of the most defining stories of Mesopotamian mythology. In the centuries before the composition of the Enuma Elish, the idea of divine conflict already existed in the shared memory of the region. Stories of cosmic battles, rivalries between gods, and struggles for control of natural forces were common themes in the older myths. As Babylon's scribes reinterpreted these traditions, they began to imagine Marduk not just as a figure touched by storms, but as one capable of confronting and mastering the turbulent forces that shape the universe. The emergence of Marduk as a Stormbearer therefore did more than expand his list of divine attributes. It prepared the people to accept him as a figure positioned at the centre of celestial conflict, someone who could stand against primordial forces without hesitation. This idea developed slowly across decades and centuries, as priests and poets shaped rituals and recitations in ways that strengthened his role. Each generation added another layer, another detail, another expression of his authority, and with each addition, Marduk's presence in the collective imagination grew stronger and more capable of anchoring the cosmology of a rising power. One of the most compelling aspects of this transformation is how naturally it unfolded from the needs of the people who worshipped him. The god they imagined in their early prayers was not a distant ruler, but a presence who could act in the world. The storms that crossed their skies were a reminder of forces beyond human control, yet they also symbolized protection. Rain brought life to fields. Wind cleared the air. Thunder could sound like a warning or a promise. Marduk's connection to these forces allowed people to imagine him as both fierce and steady, a figure whose strength was not reckless but directed toward the preservation of order. Understanding this phase also highlights how myth responds to the uncertainties of life. The ancient world was unpredictable. Floods, storms, droughts, and seasonal changes shaped the rhythm of survival. Assigning these forces to a god who was both powerful and aligned with their city gave people a sense of stability in an environment ruled by unknowns. Marduk's emerging identity as a Stormbearer was not simply a symbolic gesture, but a practical part of their worldview. It provided a framework for interpreting the natural world and offered reassurance that a powerful protector stood behind the events they could not control. As Marduk's story grew, so too did the expectation that he would one day take a more active role in the celestial order. The myths surrounding older gods contained stories of conflict, alliances, and victories that shaped the structure of the world. Marduk's developing identity placed him on the path toward participating in these narratives. He was no longer imagined as a figure standing quietly among the divine, but as a force that could rise when the universe demanded leadership. This momentum reflected deeper currents within Babylonian culture. The city was preparing itself to become a major power, and its god needed to embody that trajectory. Throughout this early development, Marduk's association with storms symbolized both the controlled power necessary for leadership and the dynamic force needed to confront cosmic challenges. It suggested that he was not only capable of responding to conflict, but that he possessed the strength to shape the outcome. This association carried implications for how later stories would unfold, especially as the myths began to explore the origins of conflict among the gods. Storms symbolized disruption, upheaval, and the shifting of natural order. A god tied to these forces could easily be imagined as someone called upon when the universe faced threats that required decisive action. These ideas gradually moved Marduk into a position where celestial conflict felt inevitable. The more he became associated with storms, the more people imagined him as someone who could face challenges that older gods had once confronted. This shift was not forced. It was a natural progression in a mythic landscape already rich with stories of battles between divine beings. As Babylon expanded and its influence deepened, Marduk's identity expanded with it, preparing him for the moment when he would stand at the center of the greatest conflict preserved in ancient Mesopotamian literature. This rise, still in its early stages, reveals how myth does not develop in straight lines but in layered growth. Marduk's identity gained weight through each generation's retellings, each ritual performed in his honor, each interpretation that attached another quality to his name. As these layers accumulated, the image of a storm-bearing god capable of meeting celestial conflict became ingrained in the minds of those who looked to him for protection and guidance. Their world demanded a deity who could correspond to their rising sense of destiny, and Marduk became that deity through the steady evolution of belief. From these beginnings, the story moves toward a deeper understanding of the conflicts that shaped the heavens. Marduk, now imagined as a figure who held the force of storms in his grasp, stepped closer to the center of the myths that would define him. In the expansive world of ancient belief, these early developments prepared the foundation for what would come as the narrative entered the era of cosmic struggle, where Marduk's strength would be tested against forces older and more formidable than anything he had yet encountered. As Marduk's presence in the ancient imagination expanded, the world around him seemed to shift in preparation for something larger than any single ritual or belief. His association with storms had already placed him among the powerful forces that shaped the sky, but what came next would push him far beyond the role of a rising deity. Across the clay tablets and incantations that preserved the memory of Mesopotamian myth, there began to appear traces of a conflict older than humanity's earlier settlements, a struggle between order and chaos, between the known world and the raw, untamed forces that existed before creation took form. This conflict would eventually become the defining moment of Marduk's rise to supremacy, shaping not only his identity but the very structure of the cosmic order. The heavens, in ancient understanding, were not a silent place but a realm filled with currents of intention, energy, and will. Gods interacted, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension, their actions reflected in the weather, the seasons, the cycles of life, and the unpredictable challenges that shaped human existence. These divine relationships, like those of the people who imagined them, could shift, fracture, or stabilize depending on the circumstances. Among these currents existed forces that belonged to a time before the gods themselves, powerful beings whose presence symbolized the confusion and instability of an unformed universe. It was within this landscape that the seeds of the great celestial battle began to take shape. In the memory of the ancient world, the struggle began when the established order of the heavens no longer remained stable. The older gods who had shaped the early universe found themselves contending with tensions that threatened to unravel the structure they had created. These tensions did not arise suddenly, but grew from the changing relationships among divine beings. Younger gods began to assert their presence. Older ones felt their authority challenged, and forces that had once rested quietly awoke with renewed intensity. While many figures were involved in these early developments, the presence of Tiamat stood above all others. She was the embodiment of primordial waters, the symbol of the earlier state of being, a vast, undivided expanse where nothing yet held form. The The story of Tiamat is not simply one of conflict, but one of transition. She represented the raw potential of creation, the deep and restless waters from which the cosmos emerged. In her earliest depictions, she was not imagined as malevolent, but as a fundamental force, vast and without boundary. As the younger gods grew in number and influence, the myths began to portray their actions as disruptive, disturbing Tiamat's long-held peace. Noise filled the cosmos where once there had been quiet. Movement stirred where stillness had reigned. This change created tension among the older gods, many of whom struggled to adapt to the shifting dynamics of a universe they no longer fully recognized. In many traditions, when order becomes unsettled, conflict follows. The same was true in the celestial world. The younger gods sought to express their authority, experimenting with the tools of creation, while the older forces reacted in ways that reflected their ancient nature. As tensions rose, alliances formed among the younger deities who understood that navigating the coming conflict required unity. Among them were powerful figures who had shaped early mythic history long before Marduk's emergence. Yet despite their combined presence, a decisive leader had not yet stepped forward, and the older forces, embodied in Tiamat, began to awaken with an intensity that suggested the heavens were on the brink of transformation. The disruption that stirred Tiamat was not merely a matter of irritation or frustration. In mythic terms, it symbolized the clash between emerging order and the deep currents of primordial chaos. With the younger gods expanding their influence, creating new patterns, and introducing innovations into the universe, the older forces felt compelled to respond. What followed in the ancient stories reflected the magnitude of this shift. Tiamat gathered an army of powerful beings, each representing aspects of the raw, untamed world that existed before structure took hold. These creatures were imagined as monstrous, not because they were inherently evil, but because they embodied forces that opposed the orderly world the younger gods sought to establish. As this army assembled, fear spread among the divine assembly. The younger gods, despite their ambitions, were not yet prepared to confront the primordial forces that had shaped the earlier state of the cosmos. Many had strength, wisdom, and skill, yet none possessed the combination of qualities required to face Tiamat's rising power. The gods gathered to discuss their options, each recognizing that the fate of the universe rested on their ability to confront a threat older than memory itself. Amid these discussions, Marduk's name began to surface, not yet as the unavoidable choice, but as a possibility, someone whose strength and emerging identity hinted at the capacity to stand against forces far older than he was. By this point in his development, Marduk had become known for his command over storms and winds, traits that made him distinct among his peers. His presence in the council was no longer that of a young god learning his place, but of someone whose leadership potential was beginning to attract attention. Yet he was still one among many, and the decision to place the fate of the cosmos in his hands was not an immediate one. The divine assembly weighed the risks carefully, considering which of the younger gods might possess the strength, clarity, and determination to face Tiamat and the forces she commanded. The more they considered, the more Marduk's qualities stood out. The conflict unfolding in the heavens was not simply a mythic battle, but a reflection of deeper ideas about power, order, and the nature of leadership. To stand against Tiamat required more than brute force. It demanded the ability to shape the wind, to harness the elements, and to navigate the delicate balance between creation and destruction. Marduk's identity as a Stormbearer gave him an advantage in these areas. His command of natural forces symbolized not chaotic destruction, but controlled strength, exactly the kind of power necessary to confront the primordial deep. As discussions continued, it became increasingly clear that he possessed qualities no other god could offer. When the gods approached Marduk, they did so with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. They needed someone who could face Tiamat without faltering, and Marduk accepted the role with a condition that reflected both confidence and foresight. He demanded that if he succeeded, he would be granted a position not just of honour, but of authority over the entire assembly. This condition was not an act of ambition, but an acknowledgement that leadership over the cosmos required clarity of structure. If he were to restore order, he needed the authority to maintain it. The gods agreed, recognizing that the universe demanded stability if it were to survive the coming conflict. With the agreement in place, Marduk prepared himself for the confrontation. In mythic terms, preparation involved more than gathering weapons or training for battle. It meant aligning his identity with the role he was about to fulfill. Storms were not merely tools to wield, they were expressions of the controlled force he carried within himself. The winds obeyed him, the lightning responded to his will, and the forces of the heavens recognized his authority. These elements became essential to the coming conflict, shaping the way the story would unfold and establishing the foundation for his identity as a god who could face the deepest layers of cosmic disorder without hesitation. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat is among the most significant moments in ancient mythology, not because of its violence, but because of its symbolic meaning. When the heavens went to war, it marked the transition from a universe defined by primordial forces to one shaped by deliberate order. Tiamat, though often depicted as a threat, represented the unformed potential of creation. Marduk, stepping forward as her challenger, represented the structure and direction that would guide the cosmos. Their confrontation was not simply a clash of strength, but a moment in which the very nature of existence was defined. As the story unfolds across the clay tablets, Marduk met Tiamat with a combination of precision and overwhelming force. The winds he commanded became tools to counter her vast presence. His lightning split the darkness. His storms created openings through which he could strike. The conflict was immense, spanning the heavens, shaking the foundations of creation and altering the relationships among the gods. Tiamat's defeat was not portrayed as a simple victory, but as an act that redefined the structure of the universe. It symbolized the triumph of controlled power over primordial chaos, establishing a new foundation upon which the world could be built. With Tiamat defeated, the creatures she commanded scattered or fell, their presence no longer capable of threatening the stability the younger gods sought to maintain. Marduk's victory was not only a triumph in battle, but the fulfillment of the promise he made when he accepted the role of champion. The heavenly order had been preserved, and the foundations of the cosmos had been reshaped through his strength. The gods, witnessing the magnitude of his accomplishment, recognized that the leadership he requested was not a matter of ambition but a necessity. Their agreement marked the beginning of a new era in which Marduk stood at the center of creation and cosmic authority. This moment, preserved through generations, stands as the turning point in his story. The conflict that shaped the sky established the foundation for the role he would play in the next phases of his rise, guiding the narrative toward the transformation of the cosmos that would follow in the aftermath of Tiamat's defeat. When the stories of the ancient world reached the moment where Marduk stood face to face with Tiamat, the tone of the narrative shifted sharply. Everything that had been building, the rise of the storm-bearing god, the gathering of the frightened divine assembly, the tension forming beneath the surface of the heavens, seemed to converge on a single point. What unfolded in this confrontation was not just the clash of two powerful beings, but the decisive event that transformed the structure of the universe and altered the destiny of the gods who watched from afar. Tiamat's last roar did not simply mark the end of a battle. It signalled the moment when the cosmos itself was reshaped, and the future of divine order took on new meaning. To understand the magnitude of this moment, it helps to see Tiamat not as a villain, but as a force that had existed since the earliest beginnings of creation. She represented the unformed waters, the deep, the vast expanse where boundaries did not yet hold, and where everything existed in a state of undivided potential. In the earliest layers of tradition, she was not imagined with malice. She was a presence woven into the fabric of existence, a necessary element of the world's origins. Over time, as the younger gods began to express themselves more assertively, the narratives around her evolved. What began as a peaceful elder force gradually became depicted as a threat, not because Tiamat changed, but because the universe around her changed, and the presence of new divine activity demanded a new understanding of the old. This shifting perception forms the backdrop of the conflict that brought Marduk into the centre of the mythic stage. As the younger gods grew louder, more active, and more numerous, Tiamat's deep stillness became something fragile in a world that no longer moved in harmony with her nature. The legends describe the moment when her patience broke, a moment when the disturbances swirling through the heavens became too much to ignore. Her stirring was not the act of a conqueror seeking dominion, but the reaction of a force pushed beyond its limit. The universe had changed around her, and the younger god's relentless activity created an imbalance she could not reconcile. The myths describe how Tiamat responded by creating an army of beings unlike anything seen before. These were not simple monsters or creatures of chaos for their own sake. They represented the forms that arise when the earliest forces of creation push back against imposed structure. Their shapes reflected unpredictability, strength, and the raw power that existed before the universe settled into defined patterns. With King at their head, a figure Tiamat elevated by granting the tablets of destiny, the army became the embodiment of everything that resisted the new order. The gods watching this unfold felt the weight of what it meant. This was no ordinary dispute. It was the resurgence of primordial force confronting the emerging organization that younger gods had been quietly building. The heavens, once united under the guidance of older deities, now found themselves divided. On one side stood the ancient force that had existed before time could be measured. On the other stood the younger gods who had entered into the world with growing confidence and ambition. The balance between creation and stability was at risk. The divine assembly recognized that a confrontation could no longer be avoided. Their deliberations were driven not by the desire for power, but by the realization that the conflict threatened to push the cosmos back toward the undivided state from which it had first emerged. It was in this moment of uncertainty that Marduk stepped forward, offering to restore balance. By now, his reputation had grown enough for the gods to place their trust in him. They had seen his command over storms, his confidence in the face of challenge, and his steady presence among the younger generation. What set Marduk apart was not simply his power, but the clarity with which he understood what the universe needed from him. When he accepted the role of champion, the divine assembly gave him their full support, knowing the outcome of the coming confrontation would shape the future of everything they understood. Before confronting Tiamat, Marduk prepared himself in ways that demonstrated not only strength, but purpose. The myths describe how he armed himself with tools suited to the task ahead. He carried the winds, the lightning, the elements that represented order in motion. Each component of his preparation symbolized a different part of the cosmos, suggesting that his power was not only physical, but deeply integrated into the structure of the world. These tools were not given lightly. They marked the moment when the gods invested their hopes in a single figure who could face the force that had existed before any of them. As Marduk approached Tiamat, the distance between them symbolized the divide between two states of being. One represented form, choice, structure, and the possibility of stable order. The other represented the vast potential of creation in its rawest state. The myths emphasize the tension in the air as the storm-bearing god faced the oceanic presence of Tiamat. His winds spun around him, steady and controlled. Her waters churned with depth and history. The contrast between them was immense, yet the narrative does not present Tiamat as an antagonist without depth. She stood as an ancient force defending a way of existence that predated the rise of newer generations. Her determination reflected a kind of resolve born from age and purpose. When the clash began, it was portrayed not as a simple battle, but as the defining event that separated one era of the universe from another. Marduk's winds pressed against Tiamat's waters, carving space where none had existed. Lightning burst across the sky, illuminating the boundary between the rising god and the ancient force. The storm he summoned was not chaotic, but controlled, directed entirely toward the confrontation. Tiamat responded with the full strength of her primordial nature, releasing waves of power that echoed through the heavens. The gods watching from afar felt the weight of each moment, aware that the clash was determining the future of existence itself. Throughout the conflict, the narrative highlights how Marduk maintained clarity and control. The winds he commanded were not wild or unpredictable. They struck with precision, limiting Tiamat's movements. His storm was crafted specifically to overcome her vastness. In contrast, Tiamat's power was immense but less directed. She represented the fullness of creation not yet shaped or refined. Her actions carried force without focus. The difference between them captured the essence of what the conflict symbolized, the emergence of purposeful order confronting the lingering presence of undivided potential. The turning point arrived when Marduk used the winds to force Tiamat to open her mouth. This detail, preserved in the ancient tablets, carries more meaning than its surface suggests. It was a moment when the storm reached into the very core of the primordial waters, disrupting the foundation of Tiamat's being. When she opened her mouth, Marduk released his winds with overpowering force, pressing them into her depths and preventing her from closing again. The act represented the transformative power of order entering into the chaos that existed before form had taken shape. Following this moment, Marduk struck with a decisive blow, splitting Tiamat in two. The myths portray this act not as destruction but as transformation. Her divided form did not vanish but became the material from which the structure of the cosmos was reshaped. The heavens and the earth emerged from her body, symbolizing the creation of boundaries, space, and orientation within the universe. The cosmos did not lose Tiamat. It reorganized her into a form that allowed creation to exist in a structured and purposeful way. The moment of her last roar, described in ancient texts with remarkable clarity, reflects both the end of the primordial era and the beginning of a new one. It was a sound that captured the weight of change, the transition from boundless potential to defined creation. That sound did not fade into silence. Instead, it echoed across the cosmos as a reminder of the foundation upon which the new order was built. Marduk's victory did not erase the past. It integrated it, shaping a universe that relied on both the force of his leadership and the material of the old. After her defeat, the creatures Tiamat had created were scattered, their roles absorbed into new patterns. Kingu, who had carried the tablets of destiny, was captured. The tablets, symbols of supreme authority, were removed from Tiamat's forces and placed under the control of the younger gods. This shift represented the transfer of cosmic order from primordial forces to the newly established leadership. The world that emerged from this moment was not merely maintained by Marduk, but grounded in the structure he had forged from the remnants of the battle. The myths describe how Marduk reshaped the heavens and the earth, using Tiamat's body, assigning places to the stars, fixing the movement of celestial bodies, and establishing the cycles that would guide time, seasons, and life. Each act of creation reflected the transformation that had taken place. The universe was no longer an undifferentiated expanse. It had become a structured environment capable of supporting life, rhythm, and meaning. These acts did not come from impulse, but from the responsibility granted to him by the divine assembly. Tiamat's last roar therefore became the turning point in the cosmic order. It marked the end of an age defined by ancient waters and the beginning of a universe shaped by intentional design. The gods who had once feared the primordial forces now stood within a cosmos where their existence had clear purpose and structure. They recognized Marduk not only as the one who defeated Tiamat, but as the god who used that victory to build a world that brought stability to the heavens. This transformation continued to unfold in the moments that followed. Marduk's rise did not end with the defeat of Tiamat. It set in motion the events that would further define his leadership and deepen his connection to Babylon and the people who honoured him. From the remnants of the battle, new possibilities emerged, and the universe moved into a new era with Marduk at the centre of its order. In the aftermath of Tiamat's defeat, the heavens did not fall into celebration. Instead, they entered a moment of stillness, a period in which the gods tried to understand what had just taken place. The universe had shifted. The order they had known was gone, replaced by something that felt new, yet not fully formed. Marduk's victory had changed the very nature of existence, but the implications had not yet settled into the minds of those who watched from afar. The dust of conflict still hung over the cosmos, and within that quiet uncertainty lay the next step in Marduk's rise, a step that would transform him from a divine champion into the supreme authority of the heavens. Even with Tiamat defeated, the threat posed by her forces had not entirely vanished. The army she had assembled, creatures formed from the raw essence of primordial chaos, had not been created for a single battle. They were expressions of her strength, manifestations of the old order resisting the shape the younger gods sought to impose. Among them, one figure stood out above all others, not because of his monstrous form, but because of the symbol he carried. Kingu, chosen by Tiamat to lead her forces, wielded the tablets of destiny. These tablets were not weapons or tools. They represented the authority to shape and command the cosmos. Whoever held them possessed the right to rule, to determine the fates of gods and worlds alike. The myths describe Kingu not as a brilliant or cunning strategist, but as a figure elevated by Tiamat's will. His power came not from personal merit, but from the tablets themselves. This distinction later became critical to understanding why the gods viewed his authority as illegitimate. He had not earned the tablets, he had been given them. And because he held them without proving himself worthy, the universe remained in a state of imbalance. For the gods, this imbalance was as dangerous as Tiamat's assault. Power without rightful claim threatened the structure they hoped to build after the turmoil. With Tiamat gone, the younger gods looked toward Kingu, recognizing that the struggle was not yet complete. His possession of the tablets meant that any attempt to establish order would be flawed unless the tablets were reclaimed. Their power could not remain in the hands of someone who had risen without demonstrating the qualities needed for leadership. Marduk, still bearing the weight of his recent victory, understood that he now faced a different kind of task. The battle against Tiamat had required strength, control, and determination. Recovering the tablets of destiny required something more subtle yet equally essential: the ability to bring closure to a struggle born from ancient imbalance. Kingu did not flee in the wake of Tiamat's fall. The myths portray him as overwhelmed, not by fear, but by the weight of responsibility he had neither sought nor fully understood. His authority fell apart without Tiamat's presence to support it. Without her force behind him, the creatures she created scattered, unsure of their place in the new order. Kingu stood alone, carrying the tablets that gave him control over fate, but no longer possessing the legitimacy to wield them. This moment captured the essence of his role in the mythic story, a figure granted power without the ability to use it responsibly. When Marduk approached Kingu, the confrontation did not unfold like the battle with Tiamat. There was no roaring wind, no thunder, no violent struggle. The disparity in strength and purpose was too great for conflict. Kingu, unable to maintain the authority the tablets demanded, surrendered. The myths do not describe a long pursuit or a clash of forces. They simply state that Marduk defeated him and stripped him of the tablets. This outcome underscored the idea that true authority cannot rest on borrowed strength. It must be earned through action, vision, and the ability to protect the order it commands. In reclaiming the tablets of destiny, Marduk completed the part of the story that established him as more than a victorious warrior. The tablets symbolized cosmic stability. They were the foundation upon which the universe could be organized. the instrument through which divine authority found structure. To hold them was to assume the role of king, not through force alone, but through the recognition of all who existed within the realm of the divine. Marduk's possession of the tablets represented the formal beginning of his kingship. The universe now looked toward him as the figure responsible for guiding the new structure that emerged from the remnants of the primordial age. The younger gods, already moved by Marduk's triumph over Tiamat, now saw in him the qualities they had been searching for: strength tempered by wisdom, the ability to act decisively without losing sight of responsibility, and the capacity to confront ancient forces without succumbing to them. These traits mattered deeply in the ancient world. Leadership required more than commanding storms or defeating foes. It required direction, clarity, and a willingness to take on the burdens of the universe. With the tablets in his hands, Marduk was no longer simply a god of storms or a figure of rising importance. He became the one who held the mechanisms through which fate itself moved. The myths speak of how the gods gathered around him after this moment, recognizing that the universe had entered a new phase. Some traditions describe the council raising Marduk onto a throne. Others speak of proclamations made in his honor. Still others emphasize the rituals that followed, assigning him roles once held by older gods. These details varied from city to city, from tradition to tradition, but the underlying meaning remained consistent. Marduk had become the central figure in the divine assembly, the one responsible for maintaining cosmic order. The significance of the Tablets of Destiny lies not only in their symbolic weight, but in what they allowed Marduk to accomplish afterward. With them, he had the authority to shape the cosmos according to deliberate design. He organized the heavens, assigning stars their places and defining their paths. He structured the movements of celestial bodies in ways that created cycles and patterns. These actions allowed time to be measured, seasons to be understood, and life to follow rhythms necessary for survival. The universe, once a place of unpredictable forces, now had shape, direction, and purpose. Beyond the cosmic structure, the tablets also gave Marduk responsibility for the order of divine relationships. The gods, whose roles had once been fluid and changeable, now found themselves part of a structured hierarchy. Their duties became clearer, their domains became defined. Worship across the land shifted to reflect these new dynamics. Temples aligned their rituals with the order Marduk established, and festivals adapted to honour the cycles he created. The Tablets of Destiny, therefore, did not simply elevate Marduk. They stabilised the entire divine world. One of the most compelling aspects of this stage in Marduk's rise is how seamlessly it ties into the political reality of ancient Babylon. The idea of kingship held deep significance in the region. A successful king was one who maintained order, ensured justice, and protected the people from threats both physical and spiritual. When Babylon emerged as a major power, its ideology of leadership aligned perfectly with the myths surrounding Marduk. His possession of the tablets mirrored the ideals of royal authority in the human world. Just as a king directed the fate of his city, Marduk directed the fate of the cosmos. This parallel strengthened the bond between Babylon and its god. The city, ruled by kings who saw themselves as servants of Marduk, carried out rituals that reinforced his cosmic authority. Each year, during major festivals, the story of his victory and the acquisition of the tablets was recited to affirm the structure of the universe. The myths, the rituals, and the political identity of the city became interconnected, forming a system in which Marduk's kingship was not only divine, but essential to the identity of Babylon itself. Understanding the meaning of the tablets also illuminates Marduk's transformation from a figure associated with storms to a god responsible for the deepest functions of the universe. Storms, while powerful, are contained within the world. The tablets, however, represent authority over everything that exists. Their presence marked the transition from physical strength to cosmic leadership. Marduk's identity expanded beyond natural forces into the realm of divine decision-making, law, and structure. His role became not only to protect, but to govern, to guide, and to maintain. The the story does not end with the tablets being placed in Marduk's hands. Their presence marked a beginning, not a conclusion. With them, Marduk initiated the process of building a world shaped by intention rather than accident. His next actions, guided by the authority granted through the tablets, would lead directly into the formation of the world and humanity itself. The myths describe how he took the remnants of Tiamat and used them to fashion the ordered universe, placing every detail with care. The tablets ensured that this creation would remain stable, that the cycles he set in motion would continue, and that the boundaries he defined would hold. Kingu, stripped of the tablets, still held a place within the unfolding story. According to the traditions, his fate became intertwined with the origins of humanity. The myths describe how his blood, mixed with clay, became the material from which humans were formed. This detail carries significant meaning. It suggests that humanity carries within itself both the order of Marduk's design and the remnants of the old primordial forces. The story portrays humans not as distant observers, but as beings connected to the very conflict that shaped the universe. This connection underscores the depth of Marduk's kingship. Through the tablets, he did not merely organize the heavens. He created a world in which humans had a role, a place within the cosmic design. His kingship extended not only over the gods, but over the fabric of existence itself. The world, with its rhythms, struggles, and possibilities, reflected his authority. The tablets of destiny, therefore, were not symbols confined to the heavens. They were the framework within which life unfolded. As Marduk continued to shape the universe, the story moved steadily toward the construction of a world that balanced divine structure with human experience. His rise, marked by the reclamation of the tablets, guided the next phase in which the remnants of chaos became the foundation of creation. The universe, once divided by conflict, moved into a period of building, adjustment, and renewed purpose under his leadership. When the storm of conflict finally settled and the echo of Tiamat's last cry faded into the far reaches of the heavens, the universe entered a moment unlike anything that had come before. The forces that once shaped existence stood scattered and silent. The primordial waters, once endless and undivided, had been split apart. The sky no longer resembled the vast and formless expanse that had existed before the younger gods began to move within it. Everything remained suspended in a state between what had been destroyed and what had yet to be created. In that space of a lingering stillness, the weight of responsibility fell entirely upon Marduk, whose victory had not marked the end of his role, but the beginning of a far greater undertaking. The universe at this stage was not a finished place, but raw material, waiting for someone to give it shape. Tiamat's body, divided in the final moment of the battle, became the central element of this transformation. Ancient traditions described her form not with the intent to frighten, but to convey scale. She represented the unbounded nature of the early cosmos, a presence so vast that even the gods struggled to comprehend her fully. Now, with her form cut in two, each half rested with potential that could be directed toward new purpose. Marduk approached this task not as a conqueror salvaging the remains of conflict, but as a builder examining the elements from which he would construct something enduring. The myths describe how he lifted one half of Tiamat's body and stretched it upward to form the arch of the sky. This was not a simple act of placement, but a moment that defined the structure of the cosmos. Before this, the universe had no defined ceiling. The heavens and the waters were indistinguishable, blending into each other with no clear division. By raising the upper half of Tiamat's body, Marduk created the boundary that allowed for separation. The sky became a domain with order, a place where celestial bodies could move in predictable patterns. It was the first step toward establishing a world in which cycles, seasons, and orientation could exist. The lower half of Tiamat's body was used to form the foundation of the earth. This too carried meaning beyond the physical description. The ground, in ancient understanding, was not simply a surface on which life could stand. It was the stable base upon which the universe rested. To create it from the remnants of the primordial deep symbolized the transformation of chaotic potential into reliable foundation. The world would not drift or shift endlessly. It held its place because Marduk assigned it purpose. The ancient stories portray this act as deliberate, steady, and entirely controlled, reflecting Marduk's role not as a destroyer, but as a designer who understood the importance of balance. Once the sky and earth took shape, Marduk began setting boundaries around the waters. Before his intervention, water flowed without limit or containment. Its movement reflected the same lack of structure that had defined the early universe. Marduk reorganized these waters, assigning them places where they would remain, whether as oceans, rivers, or distant celestial reservoirs. The myths describe how he placed guards to prevent the waters of the sky from falling uncontrolled. This detail reflected the ancient experience of rain, storms, and floods, phenomena that could not be separated from divine influence. Marduk's act established a world where water served life rather than overwhelming it. With these boundaries defined, Marduk turned to the heavens. The sky he had created needed order. Without direction, it would remain an empty ark. He began placing the stars, assigning each one a position. These placements were not arbitrary. The stars of ancient Mesopotamia held meaning tied to navigation, agriculture, ritual timing, and the cycles that governed daily and seasonal life. By placing them with intention, Marduk created a system through which time itself could be measured. This act introduced predictability to the universe, allowing festivals, harvests, and rituals to align with the precise movement of celestial bodies. He arranged the constellations, established paths for the sun and moon, and defined the intervals by which their movements would be understood. The rising and setting of the sun became a cycle rather than an unpredictable occurrence. The phases of the moon became markers of the passage of time. The alignment of stars allowed the gods and humans to understand the rhythm of the universe. These details, described across ancient texts, reflected Marduk's commitment to shaping a world where natural events corresponded to stable patterns. After arranging the heavens, Marduk addressed the structure of day and night. Before this, there was no distinction between light and darkness. The myths describe how he fixed the positions of celestial bodies so that light would not remain constant, nor disappear entirely. This balance allowed life to eventually adapt to cycles of waking and resting. The structure of time became embedded in creation itself, not as a rigid force, but as a reliable rhythm supporting all living beings. Marduk's establishment of these patterns underscored his role as a god who brought clarity to the elements that had once been unpredictable. His work did not stop with celestial order. The myths describe how he examined the winds he had used during the battle and assigned them new roles. These forces, once tools of conflict, became parts of the natural world. Some carried rain, others guided storms, and others shaped the changes in weather that defined seasons. The ability to turn instruments of war into components of daily life reflected Marduk's transition from warrior to builder. His authority involved more than defeating chaos. It involved reorganizing its remnants into systems that supported life. With the sky set, the earth formed, the waters contained, and the winds directed, Marduk began shaping the land itself. The stories speak of mountains rising from the divided body of Tiamat, their forms emerging from sections he placed with intention. Valleys took shape where he carved out space for rivers. The distribution of land and water became purposeful rather than accidental. The myths portray this process as matter of fact, steady, and grounded in the practical needs of a world that would one day sustain life. As the land emerged, Marduk created channels for rivers to flow. The ancient world depended heavily on rivers for survival, agriculture, transportation, and trade. To shape their courses was to determine the layout of future civilizations. The Euphrates and Tigris, central to Mesopotamian life, became features tied directly to divine structure. By assigning paths to rivers, Marduk ensured that the world would hold resources necessary for growth. These actions reflected the close relationship between myth and the lived experience of the people who told these stories. Their rivers were not merely natural phenomena, they were the results of divine intention. Marduk's next task involved assigning roles to the gods who had aligned themselves with him. The myths describe a council in which he distributed responsibilities with precision. Some gods received authority over celestial bodies, others over aspects of the natural world, and others over elements of human life. He did not centralize all power in himself. Instead, he created a system in which each divine presence contributed to the functioning of the universe. This distribution reflected a style of leadership that valued order rather than domination. The gods did not lose their places. They gained roles that fit within a larger structure. Assigning these roles also reinforced Marduk's kingship. His decisions shaped the future of the divine assembly. Each god who accepted a role acknowledged Marduk's authority. Their cooperation reflected the stability he brought to the heavens. This dynamic mirrored the ancient understanding of kingship in Babylon, where a strong ruler delegated responsibilities to maintain order across the kingdom. The myths used divine action to reflect political reality in a way that made the cosmic and earthly worlds align. After establishing roles among the gods, Marduk turned his attention to regulating the cycles of the heavens. He ensured the constellations would appear in order across the year. He defined the stations where the moon would rest during its phases. He assigned responsibilities to the stars, linking them to the passage of seasons. These details reflected the ancient world's close relationship with the sky. People looked upward to determine when to plant crops, when to begin journeys, and when to hold religious ceremonies. Marduk's precision in arranging the heavens created the foundation for a calendar that shaped life for generations. The myths also describe how Marduk ensured the stability of the heavens by securing the sky with bonds. These bonds were not literal ties but representations of the order he imposed. They signified that the heavens would not drift or collapse. The cosmos he created would hold its structure without constant intervention. This detail reflects the ancient belief that divine authority needed to establish stability if the world was to remain in balance. Marduk's bonds provided that stability, ensuring the universe would remain intact. With the heavens organized, the land shaped, and the waters assigned, Marduk turned to the task of filling the world with living beings. The myths indicate that life did not appear immediately. Instead, the world first needed structure. Only once the environment held stable patterns could living creatures exist within it. Marduk's approach to creation reflected deliberate planning, rather than spontaneous action. He did not rush to populate the world. He prepared it carefully before introducing life. The creation of God's dwelling places came next. Temples were imagined not as human structures, but as reflections of divine presence. Marduk designated locations where the gods would rest, oversee their domains, and receive offerings. These heavenly temples mirrored the earthly ones that later generations would build. They represented the connection between heaven and earth, a connection that became central to Mesopotamian religious life. Once the world had structure and purpose, Marduk turned toward the creation of humanity, though this stage would develop more fully in the next part of the story. For now, the myths emphasized the preparation rather than the act itself. The world needed to be complete before humans could inhabit it. The rivers needed to flow, the seasons needed to shift. The relationships among gods had to be settled. Only then could humans find their place within the design. Throughout this entire process, the significance of Marduk's actions lies not in their spectacle, but in their intention. He approached the rebuilding of the universe with a sense of responsibility rather than triumph. His victory over Tiamat had given him the right to rule, but the rebuilding made him worthy of that right. The world he shaped from the broken body of chaos reflected order, stability, and purpose. It set the stage for everything that would follow, both in the realm of the gods and in the lives of the humans who would eventually walk upon the land he formed. From this foundation, the story moves toward the next phase of creation, where the world shaped from chaos becomes the home of beings formed through a unique combination of divine intention and primordial legacy. When the work of shaping the world reached a point where the heavens held their order and the earth rested on stable foundations, the centre of the story slowly shifted back toward the realm where gods and humans would one day meet. The vast cosmic acts that followed Marduk's victory over Tiamat created structure on a universal scale. But structure alone did not complete the universe. It needed a place where the presence of the gods could be honoured, recognised, and anchored. It needed a focal point where the rhythms of the sky and earth could be reflected in the daily lives of the people who would eventually inhabit the world. This moment in the mythic narrative leads directly to the rise of Babylon, a city that was more than a city, a place that carried the weight of divine intention and stood at the heart of Marduk's authority. Babylon's significance in Marduk's story was not an accident or a later addition. It formed part of the underlying structure that united the mythical world with the physical one. In the traditions preserved through centuries, the gods recognized that the universe required a place where their presence could be concentrated, a location where their influence could be honored, organized, and maintained. Babylon became that place. It was imagined not merely as a settlement or a seat of power, but as the earthly reflection of the structure Marduk had built among the stars. Its foundations were tied directly to the cosmic order, and its creation became a defining moment in the relationship between heaven and earth. Once the heavens had been arranged, Marduk gathered the gods and proposed the creation of a dwelling place where they could meet, rest, deliberate, and observe the world below. This was not a retreat or a distant refuge. It was a place designed to serve as the central point of divine administration, a location where the order established in the heavens could be maintained with clarity. According to the myths, the gods agreed readily. They understood that the world needed a focal point, and they recognized that Marduk's authority had proven itself through action rather than assumption. Babylon's creation in myth reflects this understanding. The city was not presented as a place built by humans alone, nor as a location formed through chance. It was crafted through divine intention. The gods themselves shaped its earliest outline, establishing its significance before a single human set foot upon it. This idea embedded Babylon deeply within the cosmic narrative. It became not just the centre of earthly power, but the chosen seat of divine presence. The myths describe how the gods blessed the location and tied its destiny directly to the path of Marduk's kingship. Marduk's role in the city's formation underscored his position as the king of the gods. He was not simply given authority, he demonstrated it by shaping the cosmos and then anchoring that structure within the world itself. Babylon became the central point of connection between the patterns of the heavens and the rhythms of human life. This connection held enormous meaning for the people who later lived within its walls. When they looked to their city, they saw not only political strength or cultural achievement, but the physical symbol of their god's authority. The myths describe how the gods celebrated the city's foundation by preparing a place where they could gather. This heavenly counterpart to the earthly city became a meeting place for divine decision-making. Each god received a seat, a role, and a place within the structure Marduk had created. These placements mirrored the organization of Babylon itself, which eventually housed temples, administrative centers, and places of learning that reflected the structure of the divine assembly. The connection between heaven and earth became clear through these arrangements. The city did not merely reflect the heavens, it participated in the same order. As Babylon took shape, Marduk's presence within it grew stronger. The myths describe him as establishing his own sanctuary within the city, a place where rituals could be performed in his honour, and where the people could remember the cosmic acts he had carried out to bring order to the universe. This sanctuary, later known as the Esagila, became one of the most important structures in the ancient world. It served as the centre of worship, learning, administration, and tradition. It was imagined not only as a place of devotion, but as a reminder of Marduk's involvement in the creation of the world. The Esagila's importance extended far beyond its physical presence. Its rituals formed the basis of the city's identity. The annual ceremonies that took place within its walls were tied directly to the myths that described Marduk's rise, his victory, his rebuilding of the world, and his establishment of cosmic order. These rituals were not simple reenactments. They were moments where the people reaffirmed their place within the order Marduk created. When the priests recited the ancient texts, they were retelling the story that defined their world. Each recitation strengthened the bond between the people, their city, and their god. One of the most defining features of Babylon's spiritual landscape was the ziggurat associated with Marduk's worship. This towering structure, often known by its later name Anunnaki, held immense symbolic significance. It was imagined as a physical axis connecting the heavens and the earth. The ziggurat's height, though limited by what was architecturally possible in the ancient world, represented humanity's attempt to mirror the cosmic order in stone. Each level reflected a different aspect of the universe, rising step by step toward the sky. The structure served as a reminder that Marduk's authority bridged every level of existence. The placement of the ziggurat within the city mirrored the structure Marduk had imposed on the universe. Its base represented the earth, stable and grounded. Its middle levels reflected the air and the heavens. Its uppermost point, often reached only by priests and kings, symbolized the connection to the divine. This architectural representation of the cosmos reinforced the idea that Babylon was not simply a city, but the earthly counterpart to the heavens Marduk had ordered. To walk within its walls was, symbolically, to walk within the structure of the universe. The people of Babylon saw their city not as a product of human ambition alone, but as the result of divine guidance. They believed their god had chosen the location, established its importance, and anchored his authority within it. This belief shaped everything from daily rituals to political decisions. Marduk's presence was not distant or imagined only in mythic time. It was present in the layout of the city, the operation of its temples, the rhythms of its festivals, and the laws that governed its people. Because of this deep connection, Babylon became the centre of a cultural and religious network that stretched across Mesopotamia and beyond. Cities across the region recognised its importance, whether through trade, diplomacy or conquest. Even when empires shifted and powers rose or fell, Babylon retained its spiritual weight. Marduk's identity remained embedded in its foundations. His sanctuary, his festivals, and his rituals became part of the broader landscape of ancient civilization. The stories of his rise and his role in creation gave the city a place unlike any other, making it a focal point of learning, tradition, and cultural memory. The annual rituals performed in Babylon demonstrated the depth of its connection to Marduk. Among them, the New Year festival stood above all others. During this celebration, priests recited the story of Marduk's victory over Tiamat and the reorganization of the universe. The retelling was not merely a form of remembrance, it served to reaffirm the cosmic order for the coming year. The myths were tied directly to the functioning of the world. By reciting them, the people believed they participated in maintaining the stability Marduk had created. The festival became a moment when the boundaries between mythic time and lived time drew close, allowing the city to renew its place within the structure of the universe. Kings, too, participated in this relationship. Their legitimacy depended not only on political power, but on their connection to Marduk. Ancient traditions described how each king underwent rituals in which he bowed before the god, symbolically acknowledging that his authority came not from personal ambition but from divine approval. These rituals reinforced the idea that Babylon's leadership was an extension of the order established in the heavens. Kings ruled not as independent figures but as representatives of Marduk's cosmic authority, responsible for maintaining justice, stability, and ritual order within the boundaries of the city and beyond. The city's political and religious identity became deeply intertwined. Babylon's rulers built temples, expanded the Esagila, sponsored festivals, and commissioned inscriptions that praised Marduk's greatness. These acts were not mere demonstrations of devotion. They were expressions of the city's understanding that its strength depended on the presence of its god. When Babylon grew, its growth was seen as a reflection of Marduk's favour. When it faced challenges, the people looked toward their rituals, seeking to reaffirm the connection that underpinned their identity. This close connection between Marduk and Babylon formed one of the defining features of Mesopotamian civilization. The city stood not only as a political centre, but as the reflection of the cosmic structure shaped after the Great Battle. It became a place where divine authority found earthly expression, where myths found ritual form, and where the people located themselves within the universe's design. This relationship did not come from sudden transformation, but from the slow accumulation of meaning across centuries. Each generation added its own understanding, its own rituals, its own reflections. By the time Babylon reached its height, it stood as one of the most important religious centres of the ancient world. Marduk's throne, raised within this city, symbolised the connection between divine intention and human experience. The story that began with cosmic conflict and the reshaping of the universe now moves steadily toward the life of the people who honoured the god who created that world. Marduk's authority, anchored in Babylon, continued to guide their identity, shaping the next phases of his story and deepening the bond between heaven, earth, and the city built as a reflection of both. As Babylon grew into the physical symbol of Marduk's authority, the rhythms of life within its walls began to take on a character shaped directly by the stories of his rise. The city was more than a place to live. It was a reflection of the cosmic order he had created. Its streets, temples, markets, and administrative centres carried the echoes of the myths recited within its sanctuaries. But among all the elements that bound the people to their god, none carried more significance than the festivals that mark the passing of the year. These celebrations became the moments when myth stepped into the present, and when the people welcomed Marduk not simply as a distant divine figure, but as the protector who guided their world. The festivals did not emerge all at once. They grew alongside the city, shaped slowly by tradition, memory, and the desire to align human life with the rhythms of the universe. Each festival held its own character, reflecting different aspects of Marduk's identity. Some honoured his strength, others his leadership, others his role in creation. Yet among these, one festival rose above the rest. The New Year celebration became the heart of Babylon's religious life, the moment when the city reaffirmed the structure of the universe and reconnected itself to the origin of all order. It was during this time that the people felt closest to Marduk, not through distant ritual, but through a series of events that wove together myth, ceremony, and the daily realities of life. The New Year festival began long before the city reached its height. Its earliest form can be traced to simple gatherings where communities acknowledged the renewal of the agricultural cycle. Over time, as Babylon grew in prominence and Marduk's identity expanded, the festival took on deeper meaning. What began as a seasonal observance became a reenactment of the creation of the world. The myths that described Marduk's victory over Tiamat, his rebuilding of the cosmos, and his establishment of order became central to the ceremonies. Each recitation served as more than remembrance. It reinforced the belief that the stability of the universe depended on the ritual affirmation of its origins. The festival lasted several days, each with its own sequence of rituals, processions, and recitations. During this period, the city changed its pace. Markets slowed. Administrative tasks paused. Daily concerns were set aside. Babylon turned its attention toward the sanctuary of Marduk, recognizing that the festival marked the moment when the bond between heaven and earth needed renewal. This pause in daily life reflected a deep cultural understanding. The people believed their world existed not as a simple environment, but as a place shaped continually by divine presence. To maintain that connection, they had to give the festival their full attention. One of the most important components of the celebration involved the recitation of the Enuma Elish, the epic that preserved the story of creation. Priests gathered within the sanctuary to speak the words aloud, recounting Marduk's confrontation with Tiamat, his victory, his acquisition of the Tablets of Destiny, and his building of the ordered world. These recitations were not simple performances. They were acts of cosmic maintenance. The people believed that by speaking the story, they helped stabilize the universe for the year to come. The spoken word carried power, and each line of the epic reaffirmed the structure Marduk had imposed upon the chaotic remnants of the primordial age. As the epic was recited, the people listened with a sense of familiarity that came not from repetition alone, but from the belief that the story belonged to them as much as it belonged to the gods. Their lives unfolded within the world Marduk had created, and the festival reaffirmed that relationship. The story tied together their fields, their homes, their trade routes, and the cycles that governed their survival. When they heard the words that described Marduk placing the stars or shaping the land, they could feel the connection to the sky above their heads and the soil beneath their feet. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the festival was the procession in which Marduk's statue was carried through the city. This event drew crowds from every part of Babylon and from surrounding regions. The streets filled with people, each eager to glimpse the symbol of their god's presence. The statue was not seen as a mere representation. It was believed to carry part of Marduk's essence, allowing him to move among his people. As it passed through the city, observers felt that the protector who had shaped the cosmos was walking along their streets, watching over their homes and acknowledging their devotion. The procession followed a carefully planned path, one that reflected the structure of the city and the connection between its different districts. It passed by markets, workshops, family homes, and administrative centres, symbolically linking every aspect of Babylonian life to the divine presence. The movement of the statue also mirrored the journey described in the myths, reflecting Marduk's transition from warrior to creator to king. Each turn, each pause, each ritual gesture held meaning tied to the stories recited during the festival. As the statue moved, priests and attendees offered chants, prayers, and symbolic items that represented different elements of the universe. Some offerings reflected the heavens, others the earth, others the waters, and others the wind. These gestures echoed the way Marduk had organized the cosmos after the battle. By offering these items, the people participated in the structure he had created. They were not observers, but contributors to the renewal of the cosmic order. The king played a central role in the festival. His participation symbolized the connection between earthly leadership and divine authority. In one of the most important rituals, the king entered the sanctuary and stood before Marduk's statue. There, he underwent a series of rites intended to reaffirm his legitimacy. The high priest approached him, removed his royal regalia, and spoke words that symbolized humility and accountability. In that moment, the king stood not as a ruler, but as a servant of the god who governed the universe. After the king acknowledged his dependence on Marduk's authority, the priest restored his regalia and declared him fit to rule. This sequence held deep significance. It reinforced the belief that leadership came from divine approval and that the king's role existed within the framework created by Marduk. The ritual ensured that political authority aligned with cosmic order, linking the functioning of the city to the structure of the universe. The people witnessing this rite understood its importance, even if they did not witness it directly. They knew their ruler's legitimacy depended on this moment of divine affirmation. Beyond the city itself, the festival influenced the surrounding regions. Delegations from neighbouring cities arrived to observe or participate, acknowledging Babylon's central role in the religious life of the region. The stories of Marduk's rise had spread far beyond the city's walls, and the festival served as a reminder of the god's cosmic significance. Even those who worshipped other deities recognized the weight of the event, understanding that the stability of their own lives was tied to the structure of the universe reaffirmed during the festival. The presence of these delegations strengthened the cultural influence of Babylon. Through their participation, the city's values, rituals, and understanding of the divine spread outward across regions connected by trade, diplomacy, or shared tradition. The festival became a moment of cultural exchange, reinforcing Babylon's position as the centre of a broader network of beliefs. Marduk's identity continued to grow through these connections, extending his presence into places far from the sanctuary, where the epic was recited. The festival also shaped the daily life of the people who lived in Babylon. Preparations began weeks in advance, with families cleaning their homes, craftsmen preparing items used in rituals, and priests organising offerings. Markets filled with goods needed for the ceremonies. Travellers arrived from distant regions. The anticipation gave the city a sense of heightened energy. People understood that the festival was not just a religious event, but a time when the entire community came together to acknowledge their place within the world Marduk created. One of the most meaningful aspects of the festival was its focus on renewal. Just as the universe required reaffirmation, so did the lives of the people. The rituals encouraged them to reflect on the past year, consider their actions, and prepare themselves for the year ahead. The festival became a moment of transition, marking the passage from one cycle to the next. This sense of renewal made the festival deeply personal. People did not participate out of obligation alone. They felt connected to the story being told, knowing that their own lives unfolded within the patterns of the universe shaped by Marduk's decisions. The festival also reinforced the idea that the gods, though distant in cosmic scope, remained present in daily life. Marduk was not imagined as a ruler who watched from afar. He was seen as a protector who walked through the city during the procession, listened to offerings, and acknowledged the devotion of his people. This closeness gave the people a sense of confidence. They believed they lived under the care of a god who defeated the forces of chaos, established order, and continued to guide their world through the structure he created. As the festival continued through its many days, each ritual, recitation, and offering tied the people more closely to their god. They celebrated not only his strength, but the stability he brought to their lives. They honoured his role in shaping the universe and recognised their place within his design. The festival became the moment when the boundaries between myth and reality softened, allowing the people to participate directly in the story that defined their city and their place within the cosmos. The New Year festival was not the only celebration dedicated to Marduk, but it was the most defining. Other festivals honoured the changing of seasons, the cycles of agriculture, and the roles of the gods within the broader pantheon. Each celebration reinforced the structure Marduk had created, ensuring that the rhythms of life aligned with the patterns of the universe. Over time, these festivals became embedded in the cultural identity of Babylon, shaping everything from its calendar to its social life. Through these celebrations, Marduk's presence remained active in the daily rhythms of the city. The stories recited during the festivals did not fade into memory. They lived within the rituals, the architecture, the political structure, and the values that guided the people. This integration gave Babylon its distinct character, making it a place where the cosmic and earthly worlds met in ways that shaped its destiny. From these celebrations, the story of Marduk moved steadily into the next phase of his influence, where the connection between divine authority and earthly rule would play an even greater role in shaping the lives of the people who walked under the sky he had placed in order. As Babylon deepened its identity around the presence of Marduk, the city's structure began to reflect more than the traditions of its festivals or the stories recited in its sanctuaries. The rhythms of daily life moved gradually into alignment with the cosmic order he had established. People looked to the heavens to guide their understanding of the seasons, the cycles of time, and the responsibilities that governed their lives. Yet it was not only the movement of stars or the rituals of the temples that shaped the world. The authority of Marduk extended into the very structure of law and leadership, influencing how kings ruled and how justice was carried out within the boundaries of the city that bore his name. The idea that law and divine will were connected was not unique to Babylon, but the depth of this connection took on a distinct form when linked to Marduk. His role as the one who organised the cosmos placed him in a position unlike that of any other deity. Just as he had assigned roles to the gods and defined the boundaries of the universe, he was imagined as the divine overseer of human society. The laws that shaped daily life were not seen as inventions of kings or councils. They were understood as reflections of the order established by Marduk, shaped by his authority and preserved through the rituals that tied the people to their god. The kings of Babylon embraced this understanding fully. They did not present themselves as independent rulers shaping their cities through personal ambition. They presented themselves as caretakers of a divine order, responsible for ensuring that justice reflected the structure Marduk had created. When a king took the throne, he did so not only through political recognition but through rituals that tied him directly to his god. The process involved acknowledging that his authority came from Marduk, not from bloodline alone. The king's legitimacy rested on his ability to uphold the law, protect the people, and oversee the city in a way that honoured the order of the cosmos. The rituals performed during coronation ceremonies reflected this idea clearly. The king stood before the statue of Marduk, removed the symbols of his position, and submitted himself to a sequence of rites that represented humility and accountability. Only after acknowledging his dependence on divine authority was he permitted to resume his regalia. These actions reinforced the belief that the king's power was conditional. It was granted as long as he remained faithful to the principles that shape the world. This connection between royal authority and divine oversight created a system in which political leadership was inseparable from spiritual responsibility. The laws themselves emerged from this understanding. They were not dictated arbitrarily or through personal whim. They were shaped through a long tradition of observing how society functioned best under divine order. The structure of law took inspiration from the patterns Marduk had established in the cosmos: stability, predictability, and balance. Just as the stars moved along paths that allowed people to mark the seasons and plan their lives, the laws needed to create pathways through which individuals could navigate conflict, resolve disputes, and understand their responsibilities to one another. In this sense, justice was not merely a matter of punishment. It was a reflection of cosmic harmony. When disputes arose, the goal was not to disrupt the community, but to restore balance. The courts of Babylon followed principles that aligned with this broader structure. Judges did not rule based solely on written decrees. They interpreted the laws in ways that upheld the stability of the community. Their decisions reflected not only legal tradition, but the cultural understanding that the world functioned properly when each element held its correct place. The king, too, played an essential role in this system. He served as the final authority in legal disputes, not because he possessed unlimited power, but because he represented the connection between divine order and earthly governance. When he rendered a decision, he did so with the understanding that he was acting under the watchful presence of Marduk. His judgments were expected to reflect fairness, clarity, and respect for the cosmic balance. The people saw the king as someone who not only enforced laws, but upheld the connection between their lives and the structure of the universe. Babylonian kings reinforced this connection by inscribing laws onto monuments and placing them in public spaces. These inscriptions were not simply practical tools for governance. They were symbolic declarations that the law was a visible, permanent part of the city's identity. Anyone who walked through Babylon could see these monuments and understand that the laws represented something greater than human authority. They were reminders that the city stood under the protection and guidance of its god. The inscriptions often began with introductions that described the king's relationship with Marduk. Kings referred to themselves as shepherds appointed by the god, figures responsible for guiding their people with compassion and fairness. These introductions were not rhetorical flourishes. They were statements of identity that reflected how deeply the king's role was tied to divine oversight. The act of writing the laws in stone symbolized the permanence of the order Marduk had established. The most famous example of this tradition, though associated with an earlier period, still influenced the structure of law in Babylon during Marduk's rise. The legal traditions of the region consistently reflected the belief that law originated in the divine world. In the context of Marduk's authority, this idea took on new depth. The king ruled under the explicit understanding that Marduk observed his actions. The laws he upheld had meaning only as long as they reflected the cosmic order established after the defeat of Tiamat. The people of Babylon lived within this structure daily. Their interactions, trade agreements, family responsibilities and disputes all unfolded within a system that emphasized stability. They believed they lived in a world that functioned properly only when actions aligned with the order their god had created. This belief shaped everything from agricultural planning to business arrangements. Even the layout of the city, with its central temple and ziggurat, reflected the idea that society required structure mirroring the heavens. This understanding carried into the education of scribes, priests and administrators. Those who learned to read and write did so not just to record transactions or maintain archives, but to preserve the order of the city. They copied stories of Marduk's rise, inscribed legal documents, recorded rituals, and ensured that future generations would understand their place within the divine framework. The training of scribes involved learning not only technical skills, but the history and traditions that linked Babylon to the cosmic order. Priests held a similarly important role. Their responsibilities extended beyond performing rituals. They interpreted signs, maintained temples, recited ancient texts, and guided the people's understanding of Marduk's presence. They were custodians of memory, keepers of stories, and advisors who ensured that religious practice aligned with the laws and leadership of the city. Their work required precision, consistency, and knowledge of the traditions that had shaped Babylon for centuries. They saw themselves as servants of Marduk, responsible for protecting the thread that connected divine authority with earthly life. The relationship between kings and priests formed a central pillar of Babylonian governance. Kings relied on priests to maintain rituals that affirmed their legitimacy. Priests relied on kings to uphold laws that reflected divine order. This cooperation created a stable structure that allowed the city to flourish. When the king acted in alignment with Marduk's order, the priests supported him. When he deviated, the rituals reminded him of his responsibilities. This balance between spiritual and political oversight kept Babylon grounded in the principles that shaped its identity. The citizens, too, played a role within this structure. They participated in festivals, offered prayers, fulfilled obligations, and lived their lives according to the expectations of the community. Their daily routines reflected an understanding that the law existed not to restrict them, but to maintain the stability necessary for survival. They believed the world functioned best when each person acted within the structure established by their god. Through this belief, the people reinforced the connection between personal responsibility and cosmic order. This structure shaped Babylon's identity far beyond its borders. Other regions recognized the city's stability and the clarity of its legal traditions. Travelers, diplomats, and merchants who arrived in Babylon encountered a world guided by order, ritual, and respect for divine authority. They brought these impressions back to their own lands, carrying with them stories of how Babylon organized itself under the watchful presence of Marduk. This exchange strengthened Babylon's influence across the region, making it not only a political center, but a cultural and spiritual reference point. As the city expanded its reach, its laws and traditions spread as well. The idea that leadership required divine approval influenced neighboring regions. The belief that justice reflected cosmic order shaped how other cities approached governance. Marduk's presence, once rooted within the walls of Babylon, extended outward through these cultural exchanges. His identity as the overseer of law and kingship became part of the broader landscape of ancient thought. This influence did not diminish when new rulers arrived, or when the city faced challenges. The traditions remained embedded within the structure of Babylonian life. Even when the politics of the region shifted, the connection between Marduk, the laws, and the kings persisted. The stories recited during festivals, the rituals performed in the sanctuary, and the legal inscriptions placed throughout the city ensured that his presence continued to shape the people's understanding of order. From this foundation, the story moved steadily toward the next phase of Marduk's influence, where the old gods who once dominated Mesopotamian belief encountered the rise of a new authority, and the divine order continued to shift around the presence of the Stormbearer turned king. As Babylon continued to flourish beneath the structure Marduk had set in motion, the world around it entered a period of transition that reshaped the role of the gods across Mesopotamia. The pantheon that had once been a crowded landscape of powerful deities gradually shifted its balance. Figures who had dominated the earlier stories began to lose the influence they once held. Temples that had stood as centres of devotion slowly yielded their importance to the rising presence of Babylon's protector. This change did not happen suddenly or through force. It unfolded quietly, steadily, through the weight of cultural memory, political rise, and the lasting imprint of Marduk's cosmic achievement. The world that preceded Babylon's ascent had been shaped by gods whose stories were older than the earlier settlements along the rivers. Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Inanna, Utu, and others formed the backbone of ancient belief. They ruled over the elements, guided kings, protected cities, and shaped the earliest understanding of divine order. Their temples stood at the centre of urban life long before Marduk emerged as a significant figure. These gods were the pillars of a religious world rooted in Sumerian tradition, one that had organised human experience for centuries. When Babylon's influence began to grow, it entered a landscape in which these gods held deeply established positions. Their worship was inscribed in myths, rituals, festivals, and legal structures that had existed long before Babylon became a political force. It might have seemed impossible for a younger deity, one whose earliest presence belonged to a single city, to rise above figures whose authority had shaped entire civilizations. Yet the very structure of ancient belief allowed change to unfold gradually, guided not by destruction, but by integration. As Babylon expanded its influence across the region, it brought with it the stories, rituals, and values connected to its god. This expansion did not involve tearing down the temples of older deities or forbidding their worship. Instead, Marduk's role began to absorb the functions once associated with others. The myths that described his victory over Tiamat and his acquisition of the Tablets of Destiny emphasized that he had earned a place above all gods. This was not framed as a challenge to the older figures, but as the natural outcome of cosmic necessity. The universe required a leader capable of maintaining the structure created after the battle, and Marduk became that leader. The integration of Marduk's role into the earlier traditions unfolded in a manner that allowed the old gods to retain dignity while gradually yielding authority. Enlil, once the chief of the pantheon, saw his leadership echoed in Marduk's new status. Enki's creative wisdom became reflected in the order Marduk established. Anu's role as King of Heaven appeared in the divine titles granted to Marduk after his cosmic victory. Rather than competing with these older figures, Marduk became the vessel through which their attributes could be unified within a single divine authority. In city after city, as political and cultural ties strengthened Babylon's influence, the rituals of the region slowly shifted. Temples dedicated to older gods maintained their importance, but the central ceremonies that tied the universe together increasingly pointed toward Marduk. The recitation of the creation epic during the New Year festival became a unifying ritual across Mesopotamia. Its telling reinforced the idea that Marduk held cosmic authority and that the stability of the universe depended on acknowledging his leadership. Each repetition gently moved the balance of devotion in his direction. What made this transformation particularly significant was its quietness. The old gods did not vanish abruptly. Their temples did not crumble in a single generation. Their names continued to appear in inscriptions and hymns. Their festivals did not disappear entirely. Instead, their influence slowly softened as Marduk's presence grew stronger. His role in maintaining cosmic order made him the focal point of rituals that connected heaven and earth, and this function gradually overshadowed the earlier positions held by older deities. The shift became visible in the inscriptions written by kings. Earlier rulers often invoked multiple gods to demonstrate their legitimacy. Enlil might be named as the one who granted kingship, Enki as the provider of wisdom, Inanna as the source of victory in battle. As Babylon's influence deepened, inscriptions began to shift toward referencing Marduk as the primary figure who granted authority. Kings referred to themselves as appointed by him. They described their victories as guided by his presence. Their reforms were tied to his laws. Their cities were dedicated in his honour. These inscriptions did not erase other gods, but they positioned Marduk as the one whose favour mattered most. The priests of Babylon played an important role in this transition. They preserved the stories that explained Marduk's rise, maintained the rituals that honoured him, and ensured that the festivals reinforced his cosmic authority. They did not engage in deliberate competition with other temples. Instead, they simply continued the traditions that tied their city to the structure of the universe. Over time, as Babylon's political influence spread, the rituals performed in its sanctuary came to influence the religious practices of neighbouring cities. The priests of other temples found themselves harmonizing their traditions with those of Babylon, often without conflict or tension. The myths provided a framework that allowed for this integration to occur naturally. The decline in prominence of the older gods reflected changes in the political landscape as well. Cities that had once been as centres of worship for these ancient deities experienced shifts in power. Some declined due to external pressures, others weakened from internal struggles. As the political importance of these cities diminished, so too did the prominence of their patron gods. Babylon, meanwhile, continued to rise. Its stability, cultural influence, economic strength, and religious traditions created a lasting impression on the region. The prominence of Marduk reflected not only religious belief, but the practical experience of living within a world shaped by Babylon's leadership. The myths adapted to reflect these realities. Older stories were rewritten or reinterpreted in ways that placed Marduk in central positions. Narratives that once featured Enlil or Enki as key figures evolved to include Marduk's leadership. This process was not an erasure but a reinterpretation, one that allowed the religious landscape to adapt to the needs of the time. The ancient past was not discarded, it was reshaped into a framework that supported the new order. This adaptability allowed the myths to remain relevant, ensuring that the people understood their place within a continually evolving structure. As these changes unfolded, the presence of the old gods became quieter. Their rituals continued, but with less central importance. Their temples remained, but no longer defined the religious life of the region. Their names were still spoken, but lacked the authority they once held. The silence that settled around them reflected not disappearance, but transformation. They existed within a world where Marduk's influence guided the structure of life, and their roles were integrated into the system he maintained. This silence did not represent loss. It represented continuity through change. The old gods remained part of the cultural memory, their stories preserved in texts, their images carved into temple walls, their symbols recognized across the land. They did not vanish. They simply stepped back as the world around them shifted toward a new center. Marduk's rise did not erase them. It reorganized the divine landscape in a way that allowed their presence to persist without competing for authority. The transition also influenced how people understood the nature of divine relationships. The idea of a single cosmic leader, supported by other gods who accepted defined roles, reflected the structure of the city itself. Just as Babylon had a king who ruled with the support of administrators, priests and advisors, the divine world had a leader whose authority guided the actions of the gods. This structure created a sense of harmony, ensuring that the cosmos functioned smoothly under unified direction. Marduk's endurance reflected more than religious devotion. It reflected the stability he brought to both the divine and human realms. People believed that the world functioned properly because he maintained order. The cycles of time, the structure of law, the rituals that mark the seasons, and the protection of the city all depended on his oversight. The old gods did not vanish because they were forgotten. They stepped aside because the world no longer required their leadership to maintain stability. In this environment, Marduk's identity continued to grow. He became not only the king of the gods, but the one who sustained the structure of the universe. His presence shaped the lives of the people, the decisions of the kings, and the rhythms of the city. His endurance reflected the depth of his connection to Babylon's identity, ensuring that his story remained central to the region's religious and cultural landscape. From this quiet shift in divine authority, the story moved naturally into the next phase, where the memory of Marduk's rise would be preserved in stone, ritual, and tradition, as the people built temples and monuments that carried the weight of his presence across generations. As the old god stepped quietly into the background and Marduk's presence grew into the central force that shaped the religious and cultural landscape of Mesopotamia, the world around Babylon began to reflect his authority not only in ritual and governance, but in the very stones that formed the city. The structures built to honour him became more than places of worship. They became physical representations of memory, identity, and continuity. Spaces where stories that shaped the universe were retold through architecture, where the past was preserved through carved inscriptions, and where the people maintained their connection to the god whose actions had given form to their world. The earlier structures dedicated to Marduk were modest compared to the monumental complexes that would later dominate Babylon's skyline. At first, they were simple sanctuaries where offerings could be made, rituals performed, and daily prayers offered by those who felt the presence of their god in the rhythm of their lives. But as Babylon's influence expanded and Marduk's role became fully embedded in the structure of the cosmos, the architecture began to grow in scale and ambition. The city did not merely build for practicality, it built to express what it believed, to reflect the order of the universe, and to honour the god whose authority guided every aspect of existence. Among the structures that emerged during this transformation, the ziggurat associated with Marduk's worship held a place unlike any other. The ziggurat itself had a long history in Mesopotamia, but the one that rose in Babylon became uniquely tied to Marduk's identity. Its construction was not a simple architectural project. It was a declaration that the connection between heaven and earth was not a distant idea, but a physical reality grounded in stone and labour. The stories of creation, the rituals of the New Year festival, and the legal and political frameworks tied to Marduk's authority all found representation within its towering presence. The structure rose in tiers, each level reflecting a different aspect of the universe. Its design mirrored the way Marduk had organised the cosmos after the battle with Tiamat, establishing boundaries, defining places, and shaping the patterns that governed creation. The people who walked its steps did not see it as a mere building. They understood each tier as a reflection of the order placed upon the world. When priests climbed its levels to perform ceremonies, they were not simply ascending a tower. They were participating in a physical representation of the cosmic structure Marduk had created. The ziggurat's placement within the city reinforced this meaning. It stood near the Esagila, Marduk's temple, forming a pair of structures that served as the spiritual heart of Babylon. The temple housed the rituals and recitations that connected the people to the story of creation, while the ziggurat served as the architectural symbol of the universe. Together they formed a complex that reflected the dual aspects of Marduk's identity, the creator who shaped the cosmos, and the king who ruled over it. The proximity of the two buildings made it clear that worship in Babylon involved not only remembrance, but participation in the structure of existence. The Esagila itself grew in significance as Babylon reached its height. Its halls, courtyards, and sanctuaries were not designed to impress through size alone. They were built to hold meaning in every detail. Walls decorated with inscriptions recalled the actions of Marduk, the order he established, and the responsibilities he assigned to the gods. Floors worn smooth by the feet of generations carried the weight of rituals that bound the people to their god. Columns, altars and doorways echoed with recitations performed during festivals, tying the present moment to events that had shaped the universe in the mythic past. Inscriptions played a central role in maintaining Marduk's memory. Kings commissioned tablets and stelae carved with accounts of their devotion and the reforms they carried out under Marduk's guidance. These inscriptions did not simply praise the rulers, they emphasized the connection between their actions and the will of the god who oversaw law and order. Anyone who entered the temple or approached the ziggurat would encounter these texts. They stood as reminders that Babylon's prosperity, stability, and cultural identity were grounded in the presence of Marduk. Some inscriptions detailed the repairs or expansions of the temple, reflecting the belief that maintaining these structures was not a matter of civic responsibility alone, but an act of honouring the cosmic order. When a king restored a wall or rebuilt a shrine, he described the work as fulfilling Marduk's purpose. Each architectural improvement thus became part of the ongoing story of the city's relationship with its god. These acts ensured that future generations would understand the significance of the temple and the role it played in sustaining the connection between heaven and earth. The layout of the Esagila complex reinforced this understanding. Its rooms and corridors guided worshippers through a sequence of spaces that prepared them for encounters with the rituals inside. The outer areas served as gathering places where prayers and offerings were presented. The inner chambers, accessible only to priests, housed sacred objects tied to the mythic history of Marduk's rise. At the centre rested the sanctuary where his statue stood, the focal point of the temple's spiritual life. This statue was not viewed as a simple representation, but as an object that held a part of Marduk's presence. Its placement defined the direction of rituals and the flow of movement through the temple. During festivals, the statue played a central role. Priests carried it in carefully planned processions, moving through the courtyards, passing under archways, and circling the ziggurat. These processions allowed the people to experience the presence of their god in a tactile, visible way. They understood the movement of the statue as a moment when Marduk came closer to them, acknowledged their devotion, and reaffirmed his role as their protector. The architecture supported this understanding. The pathways, the gates, and the sightlines were designed to direct attention toward the statue at key moments, reinforcing the idea that the structure itself was part of the ritual. The influence of the temple and ziggurat extended far beyond the boundaries of Babylon. Travellers, traders, and emissaries who visited the city carried stories of its monumental architecture back to their own lands. They spoke of the towering ziggurat, the rituals of the Esagila, and the inscriptions that connected kingship to divine oversight. Through these accounts, the memory of Marduk spread across regions connected by trade routes and cultural exchange. Even those who did not worship him directly understood the significance of his temple complex. Its presence marked Babylon as a centre of authority, learning, and religious identity. As Babylon's influence spread, the architectural traditions tied to Marduk's worship influenced neighbouring cities. Temples dedicated to other gods adopted features inspired by the Esagila. Ziggurats constructed in distant regions mirrored the tiered structure of Babylon's tower. These buildings did not replicate the original exactly, but they carried elements of its design, reflecting an admiration for the symbolic meaning embedded in its architecture. Through these adaptations, the memory of Marduk extended across the landscape of ancient Mesopotamia. Even after political fortunes shifted, the influence of the temple and ziggurat persisted. Empires rose and fell, rulers came and went, but the structures dedicated to Marduk remained central to the identity of Babylon. Their presence served as a reminder of the city's history and the divine authority that had shaped its development. Long after the earliest kings had passed, and even after new powers emerged, The stories tied to these structures continue to guide the rituals, festivals, and cultural memory of the people. The architecture itself reflected the understanding that Marduk's presence endured regardless of political change. When empires conquered Babylon, many sought to restore or preserve the Esagila and ziggurat. They understood that these structures held significance not only for the city but for the broader cultural world. Some rulers repaired the temples out of devotion, others out of respect for tradition, and some out of a desire to align themselves with the authority embedded in Babylon's history. Whatever their motivations, their actions ensured that the complex remained a living part of the city's landscape. The endurance of these structures illustrates the depth of the connection between Marduk and the people who honoured him. Through stone and clay, they preserved his memory. Through inscriptions and rituals, they maintained the story of his rise. Through festivals and daily prayers, they reinforced their place within the order he established. The buildings served not only as reminders of the past, but as anchors for the present, creating a continuity that passed through generations. This connection between architecture and memory shaped how people experienced their world. When they walked through the gates of the temple, they stepped into a space where the divine and the earthly met. When they climbed the steps of the ziggurat, they felt the weight of the stories that gave meaning to their lives. When they approached inscriptions carved into stone, they understood their history as part of a larger narrative tied directly to the cosmic order. These echoes in stone were not static. They evolved as the city changed, as new rulers arrived, and as traditions expanded. Yet the core meaning persisted. The structures remained places where the presence of Marduk could be felt, where his story could be retold, and where the connection between heaven and earth could be maintained without interruption. From these enduring monuments, the story of Marduk moved toward its final movements within the ancient imagination. As scholars and skeptics across ages sought to understand the meaning of the myths and the reality behind the god whose presence had shaped the world of Babylon for centuries. As the stones of Babylon continued to echo with the memory of Marduk and the rituals that honoured him remained woven into the daily life of the city, generations moved through a world shaped by belief, tradition, and the stories recited during festivals. Yet, as the centuries accumulated, new approaches to understanding the past emerged. The world changed around Babylon, and people began to look at their history through lenses shaped by literacy, documentation, and the growing desire to distinguish myth from record. The stories of Marduk's rise, once accepted as explanations for the structure of the universe, gradually became subjects of study for scholars who attempted to investigate the origins of the god who had shaped the identity of a civilization. These scholars did not appear suddenly. Their efforts grew from the long tradition of writing and record-keeping that had defined Mesopotamian life for millennia. Scribes, archivists, astronomers, and temple scholars had always played crucial roles in preserving the knowledge of their world. They copied myths, recorded omens, documented legal cases, and maintained administrative records. Their work created an enormous body of text that allowed later generations to explore the history of the region with unprecedented detail. Over time, these records became tools for understanding not only the present but the distant past. When scholars examined the story of Marduk, they encountered a complex blend of myth, tradition, political history, and cultural memory. They found tales that described cosmic battles, divine councils, and the creation of the world. They discovered inscriptions that tied kingship to Marduk's authority. They uncovered temple archives that preserved hymns, rituals, and administrative documents connected to his worship. Through these records, they attempted to trace how Marduk transformed from a relatively minor figure into the supreme deity of the Babylonian pantheon. One of the first questions scholars sought to answer was how early the worship of Marduk began. In the oldest records, they found references to a local god associated with the city of Babylon, but these references did not describe the cosmic authority he later held. Instead, they depicted him as a figure with regional importance, tied closely to the identity of a city that was still rising in influence. These early mentions lacked references to the great battle with Tiamat or the acquisition of the Tablets of Destiny. For scholars, this suggested that Marduk's earliest role was smaller than the one known from later myths. As they traced the evolution of Marduk's identity through texts spanning centuries, they found that his rise reflected the political trajectory of Babylon itself. When Babylon was a modest city-state, Marduk's importance remained limited. As the city expanded, becoming a centre of culture, trade, law and political power, Marduk's role grew alongside it. Scholars recognise that divine hierarchy often mirrored political hierarchy. When a city rose in influence, its patron god frequently rose as well. The growth of Marduk's authority reflected this dynamic. He became a symbol not only of cosmic structure, but of Babylonian identity and state power. This connection between political history and religious development became a major focus for scholars who sought to understand the historical Marduk. They examined how the city's rulers promoted his worship, expanded his temple, and sponsored rituals that reinforced his role as the supreme deity. They noted how kings referred to themselves as chosen by Marduk, protected by him, and obligated to carry out his will. These inscriptions provided insight into the ways rulers shaped divine authority to support their own legitimacy. They also illustrated how religious tradition adapted to the needs of the state. When scholars looked at the creation epic that described Marduk's victory over Tiamat, they recognized elements of earlier Sumerian myths woven into a narrative designed to elevate Marduk above the older gods. They noted similarities between the cosmic battles described in the epic and earlier tales involving other deities. They observed how certain roles once attributed to gods like Enlil or Enki were reassigned to Marduk in later versions of the stories. These adaptations reflected not deception or fabrication, but the natural evolution of myth in a world where political and cultural landscapes shifted over time. Skeptics, working alongside scholars, viewed these transformations through a more cautious lens. They questioned the accuracy of the mythic accounts and searched for evidence that might support or contradict the stories. They compared the narrative structure of the creation epic to those found in other ancient cultures, noting similarities that suggested shared themes rather than literal events. They approached the myths as expressions of cultural identity rather than historical record. Their efforts contributed to a broader understanding of how societies use stories to define themselves and make sense of the world around them. In the archives of temples and palaces, scholars uncovered administrative documents that shed light on how Marduk's temple operated. These records included lists of offerings, inventories of supplies, and accounts of land ownership connected to the priesthood. Through these documents, they gained insight into the daily practices that sustained Marduk's worship. They saw how rituals, festivals, and temple activities were organised and funded. These records revealed the practical side of devotion, illustrating how deeply the worship of Marduk was integrated into the economic and political life of Babylon. As the search continued, scholars began to debate whether a historical figure might have provided the foundation for Marduk's identity. Some speculated that Marduk might have originated as the deified memory of a powerful ruler or a legendary hero whose actions were gradually woven into mythic tradition. Others argued that he emerged directly from the religious imagination of early Babylon, shaped by the city's desire to define itself through a patron deity who embodied its values. The lack of early records made it difficult to determine which interpretation held more weight. Despite these debates, scholars agreed that the transformation of Marduk from a regional figure into the supreme deity of Babylon reflected a broader pattern in ancient religions. Deities evolved over time, influenced by political shifts, cultural interactions, and changing social needs. Marduk's rise followed this pattern closely. It mirrored the growth of the city, the expansion of its influence, and the increasing complexity of its religious practices. Through this lens, the story of Marduk became not only a narrative of divine victory, but a reflection of Babylon's history as it moved from a small settlement to a dominant power. skeptics focused on distinguishing between the historical development of the cult of Marduk and the mythic elements of his story. They examined the creation epic not as a literal history, but as a literary work shaped by scribes and priests who sought to unify the region under a single divine authority. They analysed the language, structure, and symbolism of the epic, noting how it emphasised themes of order, leadership, and legitimacy, values that held deep significance in an era of expanding empires and shifting alliances. For skeptics, the epic served as a cultural artifact that revealed the priorities of its time. Scholars interested in astronomy found additional layers of meaning within the myths. They observed how the movements of stars, planets, and celestial cycles played a central role in Babylonian religion. The position of Marduk in the heavens, associated with the planet Jupiter, reflected his role as the stabilizing force within the cosmic structure. The visibility of Jupiter in the night sky offered a symbolic connection between the god and the movement of the heavens. Scholars examined how the planet's orbit influenced the timing of rituals, the interpretation of omens, and the structure of the calendar. Archaeologists contributed to the search by excavating temples, storage rooms, and administrative buildings connected to Marduk's worship. They uncovered artifacts that shed light on the daily life of priests and the materials used in rituals. They found tablets bearing accounts of temple repairs, offerings made during festivals, and the distribution of food to workers who maintained the sanctuary. These discoveries allowed scholars to reconstruct aspects of ancient religious practice that had remained hidden for centuries. In the ruins of Babylon, they uncovered the remains of the Esagila and the foundations of the ziggurat, providing physical evidence of the structures described in ancient texts. Though time and conquest had worn down these buildings, their remnants revealed the scale and complexity of the architecture tied to Marduk's presence. Scholars compared the archaeological findings with descriptions found in inscriptions, creating a clearer picture of the world in which Marduk's worship reached its height. Through these efforts, a portrait of the historical Marduk began to emerge, not as a figure who battled primordial beings or shaped the cosmos through divine power, but as a deity whose identity grew through centuries of cultural development. This historical view did not diminish the significance of the myths. Instead, it provided a deeper understanding of how they functioned within the ancient world. The myths expressed the values, fears, aspirations, and collective memory of the people who created them. They offered explanations for natural phenomena, justified political authority, and provided a framework for understanding the world. Scholars recognized that the power of Marduk did not lie solely in the literal truth of the stories, but in the role those stories played in shaping the identity of a civilization. The myths gave meaning to the rituals performed in the Esagila, to the annual festivals that reaffirmed cosmic order, and to the laws that guided the lives of the people. Whether or not Marduk was understood as a historical figure became less important than the fact that his presence had defined the cultural landscape for thousands of years. Skeptics, while questioning the literal elements of the myths, acknowledged the lasting impact of Marduk's story. They recognized that the creation epic, the structure of worship, and the architectural achievements tied to his name reflected an extraordinary cultural achievement. Marduk's rise embodied the way ancient societies used narrative to create continuity, identity, and stability. Even if the myths did not describe historical events, they revealed the inner workings of a civilization that sought to understand its place within a vast and often unpredictable world. The search for the historical Marduk, then, became a search for the origins of Babylon's identity. It became a study of how myth and history intertwined to create a foundation upon which a civilization built its laws, its cities, and its understanding of the universe. Scholars and skeptics alike contributed to this effort, each adding their own perspective to the task of making sense of the ancient past. From these examinations of texts, ruins, and records, the story of Marduk moved toward its final reflections, where the memory of the god endured long after the stones of Babylon had begun to crumble, reminding the world of the civilization that once honoured him as the supreme force guiding the destiny of gods and humans alike. As the centuries moved farther away from the height of Babylon and its towering ziggurats stood slowly against the wear of time and change, the world began to shift in ways the early people of Mesopotamia could never have anticipated. Empires rose and fell across the region, languages evolved, rituals faded, and the memory of ancient customs drifted into ruins buried under layers of soil. Yet through every wave of transformation, the name of Marduk continued to appear in records, inscriptions, studies, and stories passed quietly from one generation to the next. The god who once shaped the cosmic order in the imagination of an ancient civilization did not vanish with the fading of temples or the decline of kingdoms. His name endured, carried by the memory of the people who once built their world around his presence, and by the scholars who later sought to understand the significance of his story. Understanding why Marduk's name persisted long after the fall of Babylon requires looking beyond the political shifts that reshaped the region. It requires recognizing the layers of meaning embedded in his story and the role he played in giving structure to the ancient world. Marduk was not merely a figure of myth. He represented a way of understanding existence, authority, and order in a world that often felt unpredictable. His story connected the rhythms of nature, the responsibilities of rulers, the structure of society, and the rituals that gave people a sense of stability. Because of this, his memory survived even when the circumstances that once upheld his worship no longer existed. One of the most enduring aspects of Marduk's legacy lies in the story of creation that shaped how generations understood the universe. The tale of the battle with Tiamat, the dividing of the primordial waters, and the shaping of the cosmos became more than a mythic narrative. It served as a framework through which people explained the world. It offered an account of how order emerged from chaos and why the universe followed patterns that could be observed and understood. The story provided meaning to the movements of stars, the cycle of seasons, and the patterns of daily life. Even long after people stopped performing the rituals that accompanied the epic's recitation, the structure of the narrative continued to influence how later cultures thought about creation, conflict, and the balance between forces that shaped existence. The memory of Marduk's role as the organizer of the universe survived through the texts preserved on clay tablets scattered across ancient sites. These tablets, buried for centuries beneath layers of earth, eventually became sources of knowledge for archaeologists and scholars who unearthed them and recognized the importance of the stories they contained. Through the rediscovery of these texts, modern researchers gained insight into the beliefs of the ancient world. Marduk's name emerged from these tablets not as a lost figure but as a central voice in one of the most influential cultural traditions in human history. The rediscovery of these texts during the modern era added a new layer to Marduk's legacy. Scholars analysed the language, structure, and symbolism of the myths, with the intention of understanding the worldview of ancient Mesopotamia. They examined the epic of creation, the rituals associated with Marduk's festivals, and the inscriptions that tied kingship to his authority. Through this work, Marduk became known not only as a figure of belief, but as a key to interpreting the intellectual and cultural achievements of a civilization that shaped the foundations of writing, law, astronomy, mathematics, and urban life. This scholarly attention ensured that his name remained present in discussions of ancient history. Universities, museums, and research institutions continued to reference Marduk in their studies, ensuring that his story reached audiences far removed from the people who once honoured him in the Esagila. His name appeared in academic works, lectures, exhibitions, and translations of ancient texts. Even when the religious significance of his story faded, the cultural and historical importance remained firmly anchored in the study of human civilization. Another element that contributed to the endurance of Marduk's name lies in the influence of Babylon itself. The city became a symbol of ancient achievement, remembered for its impressive architectural structures, its libraries, its administrative systems, and its role as a centre of learning. The name Babylon carried weight long after the city fell. In literature, religion, and cultural memory, it became a reference point for grandeur, power, and the complexity of human societies. Marduk, as the god associated with the city, naturally remained part of that legacy. The stories and rituals connected to him became tied to the broader identity of Babylon, ensuring that his presence persisted wherever the city was mentioned. The endurance of his name was also shaped by the role he played in the political identity of the region. Kings invoked his authority to justify their rule, linking their legitimacy to his blessing. They repaired his temples, restored his statues, and inscribed their devotion into stone. These inscriptions remained long after the kings themselves had been forgotten. As later cultures encountered these surviving monuments, they encountered the name of Marduk etched deeply into their surfaces. These stones became tangible reminders of a god who once stood at the centre of political, religious, and cultural life. In the broader sweep of ancient history, Marduk's story influenced the development of religious ideas that extended beyond the borders of Babylon. The themes present in his myths — cosmic struggle, divine kingship, the organization of the universe, and the establishment of law — appeared in various forms throughout the ancient Near East. These themes resonated with later cultures, contributing to broader traditions that shaped the beliefs of people across regions connected through trade, diplomacy, and shared heritage. Though Marduk's specific identity may not have taken root in distant lands, the concepts his story conveyed left their mark on the evolution of religious thought. As new religions emerged, drawing from older traditions, echoes of Mesopotamian ideas continued to appear. The structure of divine councils, the concept of cosmic battles between order and chaos, and the connection between heavenly authority and earthly kingship all reflected elements found in Marduk's story. Even without direct worship, the ideas once tied to his role persisted in forms that shaped later belief systems. Scholars examining these connections recognized how deeply the ancient world influenced the development of human culture and understanding. The endurance of Marduk's name also reflects the emotional and cultural power of stories that define a civilization. For the people who lived in Babylon, Marduk represented stability in a world marked by uncertainty. He embodied the values that shaped their society: leadership grounded in responsibility, order maintained through clarity, and a connection between human life and the broader forces governing the universe. These values did not vanish with the fall of Babylon. They persisted in the cultural memory of the people who traced their heritage back to the ancient world, and in the stories carried forward through generations. In modern times, the rediscovery of Babylon and the study of ancient texts brought Marduk back into public awareness. As archaeological teams uncovered the remains of the city, researchers mapped the foundations of the Esagila and the ziggurat that once dominated the skyline. Visitors walked through the ruins and imagined the world in which Marduk's name had been spoken with reverence. Museums displayed artifacts connected to his worship. Books, documentaries, and educational programs introduced his story to new audiences. Each of these efforts contributed to the ongoing presence of his name in the cultural imagination. Some people today encounter Marduk's story through academic interest, others through curiosity about ancient mythology, and still others through modern adaptations that explore the stories of the Anunnaki and the civilizations connected to them. These modern interpretations vary widely, reflecting different perspectives and interests. Yet regardless of how the story is approached, the name of Marduk continues to appear, demonstrating the depth of his imprint on the narrative of human history. The endurance of his name also reflects the fascination people continue to have with the ancient world. Civilizations like Babylon captivate modern imagination because they reveal how early societies understood themselves and their place in the universe. The myths, rituals, and structures tied to Marduk offer insight into the hopes, fears, and achievements of a people who built one of the earliest complex cities in human history. Studying Marduk becomes a way of studying humanity, its creativity, its resilience, and its desire to impose structure on a world that often feels unpredictable. This enduring interest ensures that Marduk remains part of conversations not only in scholarly circles, but in broader discussions about mythology, history, and the development of human thought. People continue to explore his story for what it reveals about the ancient world and for what it suggests about the enduring power of narrative. His name appears in modern works that reinterpret ancient myths, in discussions about the origins of civilization, and in studies that examine how early societies constructed their identities. Through all of these forms, Marduk's legacy persists because his story captures something fundamental about the relationship between people and the world they inhabit. The myth of his rise speaks to the desire to understand the origins of order and the forces that shape existence. His role as a cosmic leader reflects the human search for stability, guidance, and structure. His connection to Babylon illustrates how deeply a society can tie its identity to the presence of its god. These elements make his story resonate long after the rituals that once honoured him have grown silent. From these layers of endurance, mythic, cultural, historical, and scholarly, the story of Marduk continues to move forward, carried by those who seek to understand the civilization that once honoured him as the mightiest among the Anunnaki and the one who shaped the order of their world.